That happens to me at least once a week. I don't sleep very well anymore, not since my time at Fire Tower 1 in Arlo Bennett National Forest. Every time I close my eyes, I still see the hazy purple sky hanging over the gray field. A hauntingly beautiful melody fills my ears, and I can make out the silhouettes of swaying arms, their owners trapped, melting into the writhing field. Nightmarish creatures lurk among the swaying forms. Gary Vincent is there too. Gary still shrieks in my dreams. It's too late for us? Go. I always open my eyes just as the massive, hellish hand breaks through the fog. The terrible foghorn roar still rattles in my ears even after I open my eyes. Rather than close them again and nod off in silence, I keep my mind occupied until I fall asleep from pure exhaustion. It's that in-between state where the memories come back. That strange halfway moment dividing waking life and blissful slumber. Sometimes I worry that in that halfway place, maybe I really am back. Maybe it still has a hold on me. So now, I watch TikTok every night until I pass out. There's none of that in-between state then. One moment I'm watching some middle-aged guy show me how to make beef jerky, and the next I'm fast asleep, unless I drop the phone on my face for the 1,000th time. Then we start the entire process over again, sore nose and all. I work as a forestry technician now. Most people just call us rangers, and that's fine. Sounds cooler than the actual title anyway. Hell, I call myself a ranger more often than not. Forgive me if I use the term from time to time. It seems to resonate with people and makes a bit more sense, so why confuse them with technical jargon? For the first few months after I left Arlo Bennett National Forest, I traveled the country and assisted various ranger districts with fire preparation and controlled burns. Wildfires have been on the rise the last few years, and the service was more than happy to let me move between locations to help with readiness efforts and shore up fire lines. It also gave me an excuse to spend my free time searching the forests for staircases. After my time at Fire Tower 1, I traded in my ratty old shitbox car for a used Toyota Tacoma and bought a Coleman lantern camper. My first assignment had included a cabin, but I quickly discovered that Forest Service employee housing was becoming rare. The infrastructure was poorly maintained, and even if you found one, it was often dilapidated. If you wanted it fixed, you had to do it yourself. The camper was cheaper than renting a nearby apartment, and most sites had a parking slab with an electric hookup. It didn't take long to find out that spending all my free time in the woods looking for another one of those otherworldly staircases made me a bit of an outcast among other forestry workers. We work 10-hour days, 4 days a week. Most crews hang out around bonfires or go hiking together on off days. They always invited me, but I politely declined. I wanted to go, but my horrific dreams made me feel bound to search for those damn stairs. Hundreds of miles of hiking and sleepless nights produced nothing. I never found another staircase. Sleep didn't come back, but my desire to continue searching eventually faded. Maybe the one I destroyed was the only one. It was a comforting thought, but not one I really believed. After a few uneventful job assignments, I was requested to assist with an invasive species control team in Kentucky. Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area is a near 172,000-acre stretch of land surrounded by Lake Barkley, Kentucky Lake, and the Cumberland River, stretching across the border from Kentucky to Tennessee. It was once operated by the Tennessee Valley Authority, but in 1998, Congress moved operations under the control of the U.S. Forest Service. Back around 2000, pockets of imported fire ants started popping up in the woods of western Kentucky. The little bastards had a nasty habit of crawling into electrical boxes, chewing up wires, killing native ant species, and even wiping out bird populations by invading nests. They'd cost the Forest Service millions over the decades, and they'd started cropping up again recently. We needed to curb their spread before it got out of hand. The little red shits weren't usually active at night. As I lay on the thin camper mattress, I closed TikTok and flipped over to my work email. My boss had forwarded a message a few days ago, letting me know I'd be meeting with a forestry tech named George McDonald the following morning. They were newly assigned to the project as well, but had worked at LBL in previous seasons and knew the lay of the land. George would pick me up at my campsite so we could start mapping infestation areas and put together a plan of action to exterminate those damn ants. Thumbing TikTok open again, I scrolled through a few camping and hiking lifestyle videos, only watching for a few seconds here and there. My algorithm was heavily influenced by my work. Scraggly men starting fires with a 9-volt battery and gum wrapper, or attractive young women making rocket stoves from logs. You can guess which ones caught my attention more often. I was lonely, okay? Maybe it wasn't the classiest move, but don't act like you haven't done the same crap. I yelped as my phone slipped through my hands and smacked me on the face. Once again, dropping my phone on my face twice in one night was enough. I tossed it on the laminated wood table beside my bed and pulled the blanket over my head. The soft humming from the propane heater filled the camper as I closed my eyes. It was only mid-September, but a chill had already started settling in during the nights. A Honeywell fan thrummed noisily on the floor, helping drown out some of the sounds in my head. I closed my eyes, but the voice was still there. "It's this way." Gary Vincent's voice echoed in my mind, his dirty, maddened face floating behind my eyelids. "Come and see." Smoke drifted into my face, making my eyes water. A smoldering Marlboro in my right hand, almost forgotten, burned low and caused a swell of heat on the top of my index and middle fingers. I had been staring into the distance while waiting for George McDonald and let the thing burn down to the butt. Leaning over, I dropped it into the newly emptied Folgers can and listened to the cherry sizzle in the inch of water I'd added to snuff them out. "It's the dry season here. Killer," a voice called from down the gravel drive. "Smokey the Bear wouldn't approve of you flicking cigarette butts into a metal can with all these fall leaves blown around." I looked toward the voice and saw an attractive woman walking toward me. Her jeans were tucked into the tops of brown hiking boots, and her strawberry blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun. A blue coat fluttered in the breeze, noisy as the synthetic material rippled. She stopped 20 feet from where I sat on the metal steps of my camper and smiled at me. Her face was round, and the corners of her eyes wrinkled slightly. I smiled stupidly back. "There's water in the bottom," I said, pointing at it. "Keeps the can from getting too hot or sending embers out into the woods. Smokey may not approve, but I like to think I'm not too careless." "It's a nasty habit," she replied, hands on her hips. "My father always said you should only smoke if you're on fire. It was a little morbid, but memorable." "Yeah, I only smoke about 3 a day. 1 in the morning, another after lunch, 1 more before bed. Trying to stop, though." "Down from a pack a day," I said. She arched her eyebrows in faint amazement. For a moment, I thought about correcting myself and telling her I was down from 2 packs a day, but didn't think she'd be impressed. "Anyway, can I help you, ma'am? I'm waiting on a ride from a coworker, but I'd be glad to help you before they get here." "I'm just poking around off the north-south trail, but thanks. If you're looking for a man named George, he's sitting on a fire service truck down at the end of the drive. Said he's waiting on someone named Garrett Parker," she said, her smile fading into concern. "He seems kind of pissed. Big fellow, none too friendly. Seems like he's in a bad mood." "Shit," I muttered, pushing myself from the step and tossing my hiking pack on my back. I started walking down the gravel path toward the main road. Email said he was going to pick me up at the campsite. "Thanks for the heads up." "No trouble," she chirped. "Mind if I walk with you? I'm heading back down anyway." She fell in beside me before I could even answer. Usually I would have been excited about the company, pretty as she was, but panic was swelling in my chest. It was my first day of work at Land Between the Lakes, and I had already managed to piss off my new coworker without even meeting him. Historically speaking, making friends with the other techs hadn't come easy. This was a bad way to start. I must have misread the email, and I immediately began rehearsing an apology in my head. The young woman chatted lively as we trudged down the gravel road, tall trees shading our path and making the day feel cooler than it was. I was only half listening, as she talked about hiking the Canal Loop Trail and camping on Honker Lake, places I'd heard of but never seen. Occasionally, I'd nod in agreement to something I'd only half heard, but inside, the dread of meeting the large, angry George grew. We neared the end of the road, and I could see the nose of a white Forest Service pickup poking out from behind the tree line. As we rounded the bend, I looked at the truck. The windows were rolled down, and the cab was empty. I walked toward it and tossed my hiking pack in the bed, turning my head side to side. Images of a hulking man waiting angrily nearby danced through my mind. My eyes scanned the woods for any sign of George. That's when I heard the engine of the pickup roar to life. "Can I hop in?" the round-faced woman asked. I turned around to see her grinning from behind the steering wheel. "Got at least 8 miles to survey today, and we'll have to hike 5 of them both ways." I stared at her, confusion plastered on my face as I walked toward the open window. "George MacDonald," she exclaimed happily, extending a hand in my direction. I took it and shook, still confused. "My friends call me George. Makes me sound all tough and official. Georgia is a little soft, don't you think? Hop in. It's a bit of a drive to Fiddler's Hollow." The tires of the F-150 rumbled on the road as we cruised through the high trees. Their green leaves were giving way to bursts of brilliant yellow and red, piling up around the trunks and scattering across the road in the stiff breeze. We rode in silence for a few minutes while I took in the scenery. Georgia. Must have worried I was upset by her joke and broke the silence. "I'm sorry, Garrett," she said, voice soft and sympathetic. "It was just supposed to be a little icebreaker joke, but I'm not feeling too great about it now." "It's fine," I said, maybe a little too eagerly. "Sorry if I'm being quiet. Just dragging ass from a long drive and a bad night's sleep. The changing leaves are kind of hypnotizing, too. I've been working down in Ocala, Florida for a while, and the deciduous trees are a refreshing sight." "First time in Kentucky?" she asked. "No," I replied. "I'm actually from Kentucky. Grew up near Arlo Bennett National Forest." The name stuck in my throat for a moment. "A mountain boy, huh?" she prodded, her voice bright. "Well, welcome to the flatlands of western Kentucky. Not as scenic as the eastern portion of the state, but it isn't too shabby. I worked a season at Arlo Bennett myself. What did you do there?" I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to answer. Georgia's bright personality was a bit disarming, and she was easy to talk to. But I knew the first question would lead to another. If she had heard about Gary Vincent's disappearance or the mysterious fire I had set to destroy that hellish staircase, she might put 2 and 2 together and connect them to me. I doubted she would assume I'd set the fire, but you never know. Ignoring the question wasn't an option, though. I decided to take my chances and answer honestly. "I worked as a fire lookout for a few months," I said finally. "Really boring gig, really. Lived in a small cabin at the base of a tower and watched for any signs of fire during the day. Spent my days off hiking the trails and camping. It was a decent posting, but I got a little bored and asked for a transfer. Now the service lets me travel and fill in wherever they need help. HR calls me a rambler. I guess that's pretty accurate." She nodded as I rattled on about my time at Arlo Bennett, and I hoped the information dump was enough to head off any follow-up questions. As luck would have it, that did the trick. Georgia responded by telling me about her rotation at Arlo Bennett, working at the Gabbard Pond Wildlife Center. She gave tours, mostly to groups of schoolchildren, showing them the various species that lived in the area and teaching them how to spot signs of animals on the hiking trails. The Wildlife Center was as far from the fire tower stations as you could get and still be in Arlo Bennett, and it made me breathe a sigh of relief. Not that there was no chance she had heard about the strange things that had happened at Fire Tower 1, but the lookouts and the other park employees didn't spend much time together. It seemed unlikely she knew, and if she did, she didn't seem to care. "So what made you leave Arlo Bennett?" I asked, half wondering if she had seen something strange and awful there too. "There was a man," she responded, her tone sounding less chipper. "Arlo Bennett was my first assignment. We met during orientation. He was sweet at the start, but sometimes you don't really know people as well as you think. I'm sorry, I said, at a loss for how to navigate what sounded like a treacherous conversation. So he transferred out to get away? Yeah, she sighed. He wasn't dangerous or anything, just, I don't know, he changed. We drove on again without talking for a while, the sounds of the tires on the road filling the silence. That conversation was more interaction than I'd had with a coworker in months. It was a strange feeling, but I liked it. I enjoyed the company for a change. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned a lot about Georgia as we hiked the woods around Fiddler's Hollow and mapped out nests of fire ants. She had gone to work at the University of Kentucky before joining the National Forest Service after transferring to LBL. She had grown up in the area, enrolled in the occasional class at Murray State University, and planned to get her master's degree in conservation studies. She loved horror movies, but hated watching them alone. Camping and hiking took up most of her free time, which made sense. Most forestry techs are pretty predictable on that front, and I was no different. It worked out well for both of us, anyhow. Our work surveying Fiddler's Hollow was going to take nearly a month, and setting up a campsite was easier than hiking back to the truck and driving home every day. We would survey for 8 to 10 hours a day and then put up a tent and stoke a small cooking fire. We talked late into the night, sitting in folding chairs and staring into the dying embers. At first, she carried the conversation, making up for my developed social anxiety, but slowly I came out of my shell. It was the happiest I'd been in months. But we never talked about the man she had left in Arlo Bennett, and we never discussed my time at Fire Tower Number 1. So why is this called Fiddler's Hollow? I asked one night as we ate cups of hot soup around the fire. The day had been long, mapping 3 new nests of fire ants and marking them for the extermination crew. Is there some magical hillbilly who plays a fiddle by the lake? Georgia laughed and wiped soup away from her mouth with the back of her hand. Never thought I'd live to see the day an Eastern Kentucky boy tossed around the word hillbilly with no sense of irony, she told me. Ma'am, we citizens of Eastern Kentucky are the height of sophistication. I bet you really call it Fiddler's Holler. She laughed again, leaning back in her old chair as we traded barbs. I smiled and continued eating my soup, knowing damn well I had told her a few days ago that I had grown up in a holler myself. My southern accent was minimal at best, but some of the county colloquialisms still poured through like molasses. It's kind of a dark story. You sure you want to hear it? I nodded, and she set her soup mug on the ground by the stone fire pit. She wiped her mouth again and cleared her throat, settling back into her chair. While she settled in, I fished a flask of Bardstown bourbon out of my pack, took a draw, and handed it to Georgia. She took a long pull and smacked her mouth. I leaned forward and put my elbows on my knees, taking back the flask as she started the tale. Kentucky Lake wasn't a natural formation. It was created by the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1944 by damming the Tennessee River, which allowed for better flood control and the creation of a hydroelectric dam. Hundreds of people were bought out of their homes and forced to move for its creation. And, while many happily accepted the payments, many others didn't want to leave their family homes. The TVA was making a final round of purchases when they came to the homestead of an old man named Elias Brown. Elias had declined their offer to purchase his property numerous times, and they had finally received a court order forcing him to sell. He had always been known as a kind man when he visited the town to buy supplies, playing his fiddle outside the general store and collecting change in return. But he became volatile and reclusive as the date of the new dam approached. I'm an old man, he told them. I don't have many years left. Just let me die in peace here, and you can take the land. You can have it, understand? Just don't take an old man's home. They didn't listen. Eventually, with the help of local law enforcement, they removed him by force, and he swore he would punish them for taking his land. Elias purchased a new piece of property on the edge of the newly formed lake and built another cabin. secluding himself from the increasingly developing society around him. He rarely came to town, but as the lake began to draw campers and tourists to the area, people reported hearing violin music coming from the woods. People would report seeing Elias walking through the forest, playing his fiddle. Children began to follow him as he walked, marveling at the strange man and dancing to the music. Then the children started to disappear, 5 in all. All of them belonged to the families of prominent local officials for the TVA, or from families who had championed the construction of the dam and the creation of the lake. They searched frantically for weeks to no avail. None of them returned home, and no bodies were found, causing a panic in the small surrounding communities. Locals begged the sheriff to arrest Elias Brown for the disappearances, but there was no evidence and nothing could be done. He continued wandering the woods and playing his fiddle beside the lake. A group of citizens, a mob, more accurately, gathered near Elias's cabin to confront him and demand answers about the missing children. One of the grieving parents brought a length of hemp rope and fastened it into a noose, tossing it over a heavy oak branch outside the cabin. If he wouldn't tell them where the children were, they would string him from the tree in revenge. The group knocked on the door, but no one answered. Milling amongst themselves, the townsfolk discussed whether or not they should force their way in, when suddenly they heard a small voice, a child's voice, coming from behind the rough-hewn door. It cried softly, but wouldn't answer the mob's pleas. A mother in the crowd shrieked, certain it was her daughter, sending the mob into a frenzy. The woman's husband began to throw himself against the door until the latch gave way and it swung inside. They poured in, scouring the cabin, but finding no sign of the crying child. A fire burned low in the hearth, and a half-eaten meal sat on the rickety table. A craftsman's bench was pushed against the wall, covered in woodworking tools, and one of the men inspected them for signs of blood, thinking the old man may have used them to harm the children. Elias was gone. But worse, they couldn't find the child they had heard crying from outside. The mob tore the cabin apart from top to bottom, but found nothing. No signs of the children. No hint as to where Elias Brown had gone. They began to walk from the cabin, but one man remained behind. He lifted a kerosene lantern from a hook on the wall and poured the fuel onto the floor. Using the poker by the hearth, he knocked a burning ember from the stone and sent it scattering into the kerosene. A small flame erupted. The townspeople watched as Elias Brown's cabin collapsed in on itself, engulfed in fire and blazing wildly in the night. They looked at the wood line at the edge of the hollow, expecting the old man to return and see what had happened to his home, but no one appeared. Even as the blaze smoldered into a shapeless pile of ash, he never appeared. But from the darkness, they heard the shrill cry of a fiddle, and a hoarse, creaking voice began to sing. I stroll through the woods where shadows creep. My fiddle sings both rich and deep. Children gather, their eyes so bright. Drawn by my song and lost to the night, follow my fiddle into the unknown, whispers in the woods a melody sown. Their laughter fades, swallowed by the trees, gone in the wind on the haunting breeze. Their laughter, their joy, a fleeting sight, guided by music into the night. They dance, they spin, caught in my spell, into the woods where secrets dwell. But hark, take heed the warning cry. Beware the song where lost souls lie, for in these woods where darkness looms, children vanish to eerie tunes. So I play on the fiddler's call, but heed this tale lest you should fall, for in these woods where shadows reign, beware the lure of my haunting strain. Okay, I said, leaning toward the fire, transfixed by the story. Who the absolute hell could remember all that terrifying song? My father was a librarian around here when I was a kid, Georgia said with a laugh. The library has a local legend event every Halloween. Must have heard the damn thing nearly 20 times. Well, that is a sad, strange story, I said, lighting my last cigarette of the evening. Did they ever find those kids? Or is it all made up? The kids went missing, but I'm not sure the whole Elias Brown thing is accurate. They never found any of the kids that I'm aware of. Folks think Elias killed them to get back at the people who took his home, but who knows? A few years ago, the Kentucky State Police tried to get a warrant to break open the cairns at Half Man Rock, but the judge denied it. Guess he didn't want to piss off the church. Wait a minute, I said in confusion. What the hell is Half Man Rock? Another spooky local legend, she replied, holding her hands above her head like a prowling beast. Never heard of it? I thought you were a Kentucky boy. A Kentucky boy I am, I replied with a smirk. But I'm from the sophisticated mountains, remember? Never heard of Half Man Rock. It's some weird shit, that's for sure, Georgia said more seriously than before. It's not really a rock, though. There's a private patch of property that runs adjacent to the LBL area, pretty damn close to Fiddler's Hollow. There are all these stone cairns, stacks of rocks about waist high, man-made. They look super old, but some local historians think they were made by Shawnee or Chickasaw tribes. No one's sure, though. So why did the cops want to bust open the cairns? Did they think the kids were inside? She shrugged. Maybe so. The property is privately owned by the Chapel of Truth Beyond, a bunch of New Age weirdos that set up on the property back in the 50s. Not too far back, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, some teenagers hopped the perimeter fence and vandalized one of the cairns. Kicked it over, I think. The church didn't call the cops, but the kids did. Oddly enough, they said when the stones fell over, human bones rolled out. You're shitting me, I nearly whispered. Did they belong to the kids? No, they were full-grown adults, and the bones were found to be much older than those of the kids who went missing. Not that it isn't weird enough that it had bones inside, but it was only the lower half of a person, hips, legs, and feet. The top half wasn't there. Investigators said the stones were held together by hardened clay. Anyway, once it was determined that the bones were likely of a historical nature rather than true crime in real time, KSP left the property and called it closed. I asked why the site hadn't been studied by archaeologists. Georgia explained that several universities, both in-state and out, had contacted the Chapel of Truth and requested permission to examine the cairns. Still, the church had declined, stating they wanted to keep them intact to respect whoever had left them there. She didn't know if any Native American organizations had shown interest, but the church seemed to have ample funds to cause legal issues for anyone trying to gain access to the property. Any clue what the Chapel of Truth is all about? I asked, stubbing out my cigarette and tossing the butt in the fire. Kind of weird for a cult, I guess, to be set up in rural Kentucky. No one knows much about them, she said. They dress normal enough when they load up on groceries at Walmart. They seem to be pretty friendly when folks talk to them, but they don't allow people on the property, and they don't really seem to be recruiting. At least locally, that is. I stood up and stretched my back and legs, not realizing how long I'd sat hunched over listening to the strange stories. Georgia stood too, leaning over to grab the metal bucket of water and dousing the fire with a pop and a sizzle. It was already past the time when we usually turned in, and I was beyond exhausted. The morning would come sooner than I liked, so I turned my head towards the tent. Want to see one of the cairns tomorrow? She asked before I stepped into my tent. There's one that's outside the fence near the church. It isn't exactly on federal property, but Chapel of Truth doesn't own it either. We need to check the forest border for ant nests anyway. Wait, if there is a cairn outside of the chapel property, why don't the universities just check that one out? They did, a few years back, Georgia replied. Did a seismic scan or ultrasound on it, not sure which. I'm not much of an anthropologist. The images just showed the same thing they found in the one busted open near the chapel. So you want to see it? Hell, why not? Can't possibly be the weirdest thing I've seen, I said without thinking. Georgia perked up an eyebrow and was ready to ask me to elaborate, so I quickly jumped in my tent and began to zip the screen. Sleep tight, old George. As I settled into my sleeping bag, my heart hammered. I reminded myself to be more careful about what I said to her. We had gotten close over the past few weeks, and on more than one occasion, I had nearly asked her if she had any strange experiences at Arlo Bennett. It would inevitably lead me to dumping my guts about the awful staircase and the hellish world that lay beyond. I'd gone a long time without a friend to talk to, and part of me desperately wanted to tell her. She wouldn't believe me, though. Who could blame her? Nothing about it was believable. And if I hadn't seen it for myself, I would call anyone insane who tried to convince me a place like that could exist. I lay there for hours, listening to the sounds of the night. A light rain had started an hour before and was steadily picking up. It had the sound of a late fall thunderstorm, and I was beginning to question whether we should make the arduous hike back to the truck sooner rather than later. My phone had barely any coverage out there, so my nightly routine of watching TikTok videos until I fell asleep and dropped my phone on my face wasn't an option. Most nights, since I had started working with Georgia, I went to sleep fairly easily. She exuded happiness and positivity, and I think after all that time, it had rubbed off on me. But that story about Elias Brown, the stone cairns, they left me unsettled. No more than urban legends or strange piles of rock, but I didn't like it. Something about it felt unnatural, like finding a flight of stairs in the middle of the forest. I'm not sure how long I lay there, but sleep never came. The first week we'd gone out together, I'd brought along a paperback book to read during the nighttime, but I'd left it in my camper once sleep had become easier. I was regretting leaving it behind and was trying to download the Kindle app on my phone when I heard the rustling of a tent flap. Someone was trying to get into George's tent. Slowly, I reached into my backpack, pulled out a handgun, and quietly pushed myself up from my sleeping bag. My knees both popped as I crawled toward the flap of the tent, and I paused, afraid the intruder would hear me. After a moment, the sound of the zipper continued, and I began to move again. Lifting my hand to the tent flap, I pulled down the zipper and sprang from my tent to confront whoever was trying to get into hers. Outside, her hair wet and matted to the sides of her head, was Georgia. She stood just outside her tent, wearing a long black t-shirt. Her hiking boots were on, untied, laces dangling to the side. Her eyes were fixed on the tree line to the north. The night was cold, and a chill was already settling in on me, but she just stood there, not so much as a shiver. She hadn't even acknowledged my presence. "Georgia," I said softly, hoping not to startle her, "are you okay?" She didn't respond, still looking off into the distance. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth gaped open just enough that I could hear her taking deep, strained breaths. I stepped forward slowly, reaching my hand toward her and placing it gently on her shoulder. She jumped as my hand made contact with her, and she looked at me. "Garrett?" she asked, looking confused. I'm sorry. I thought I heard something. Just wanted to see what it was." "What did you hear?" I don't know," she stammered, her body starting to shiver. It sounded like music. I listened but heard nothing but the sounds of fat raindrops spattering over our tents. A chill ran up my body, remembering the whistling in the woods I had heard as a child, and again during my time at Arlo Bennett. Night music. A voice whispered in the back of my mind. "I don't hear anything, Georgia. Just the rain. You need to get inside. The rain's picking up." "I guess I don't either," she said with a forced laugh. Her eyes were still wide and filled with apprehension. "Garrett, I know this is weird, but can I sleep?" "No, never mind. That's too much." "What is it?" She looked at me, her eyes glinting with discomfort. I thought I could see tears mixing with the raindrops on her face. Georgia looked like a child too embarrassed to tell their parent that they were scared of the dark. "I don't want to be alone right now," she almost whispered. "Grab your sleeping bag. Come on in. Plenty of room in my tent." Georgia crawled inside and unrolled her bag beside mine. I ducked back in and zipped the flap behind us. For a moment, I thought about sliding the gun back into my pack, but decided to leave it, safety on, beside me on the ground. She had already nestled into her sleeping bag, and I crawled into mine, closing my eyes. A few moments later, I felt her soft hand grab my arm and drape it over her shoulder. Nervous at first, I pulled her close to me. She was still shaking, but not from the cold. Rain fell through the night, picking up steadily and giving way to distant cracks of thunder. Georgia shuddered with each one, and I held her tightly until she fell asleep. During the day, she seemed so much larger than life, but in the dark and noisy night, she seemed so small. I closed my eyes, trying to find sleep, but the storm raged on, and I wished for the solid walls of my Coleman back at the campground. Now and again, through claps of thunder, I thought I could hear sharp, melodic shrieks. No, not shrieks. The sound of a piercing violin in the night. We woke late the next morning and tore down our camp in the rain. The storm had raged late into the night, and I had hardly slept. Georgia seemed to have finally faded off, huddled against me and snoring lightly until the sky began to lighten a bit. She crawled from her sleeping bag, looking back at me with a slightly embarrassed look, and darted to her tent to dress. We were packed and on our way back to the truck 20 minutes later, never speaking a word. Rain slapped hard against the hood of my jacket as we trudged through the trees, heads down and stepping carefully. There wasn't much grass below the heavy autumn canopy, and the ground had turned to thick, treacherous mud. Georgia, more graceful than myself, had fared well, but I fell at least 3 times hiking down the steep incline, sliding without purchase and coating my jeans in the cold sludge. "You okay?" she asked each time, helping me up. "We can set up shelter and see if the rain dies off." I told her I was fine, and we continued through the cold drizzle. Camping during our work week had seemed like such a good idea, but as we churned along, I reminded myself every 10 steps that driving back to the camper every night would be worth the time from then on. We still had 4 miles to go until we got back to the truck, and I was already soaked to the bone. A few hundred feet from Almond Creek, I could hear a steady, static-like roar. We trudged through the trees, the noise growing louder with each step, and as we broke through the tree line near the creek's edge, we both saw high water, white and foaming against the rocks, flowing quickly. "You think we could make it across?" Georgia asked, already knowing the answer. The creek was nearly 15 feet wide and at least 4 feet deep. It's a 6-mile hike to the nearest bridge across that I know of. This rain doesn't seem to be letting up. I looked at the jagged rocks poking out of the rushing water and imagined skewering myself, trying to land on them and jump across. Reaching into my coat pocket, I pulled out my cell phone and stared at the no service icon in the top corner. The storm had been bad the night before, and it seemed to have knocked out the service. Calling for help was out of reach, and my anxiety was beginning to swell. "Any other options?" I asked, shoving the phone back in my pocket. "Maybe a shelter nearby or something?" "The only shelter I know of is back the direction we came," she replied unenthusiastically. "The Chapel of Truth is only a mile past our campsite from last night. I've never been there, but I'm sure they have a phone. Even if they don't, there's a gravel trail from their compound back to the main road. It might be easier to head that way than trying to loop around the creek, but I've never been on it." "Do you think they'd let us use the phone?" I asked. She shrugged in response. "Can't hurt to try," she exclaimed, a sparkle of her energetic personality breaking through the gloom. "Worst case scenario, we've got enough food for another night, and we can make it back tomorrow. Besides, I can show you one of the cairns." I laughed at her sudden burst of optimism. We turned and headed back in the direction of our campsite. Making our way up the gradual incline was more difficult than coming down, but with a new plan in place, the air between us seemed a bit lighter. Georgia talked excitedly about her class at Murray State, while I mostly listened, concentrating on not sliding back down the hill. After an hour and a half, we made it back to our original camp, tossed up a tarp, and unfolded our collapsible chairs to rest. Starting a fire would be impossible, waterlogged as everything was, but I pulled a can of Sterno out of my pack and lit it to warm our hands. Georgia began to put on a dry pair of socks, and I pulled out a spare pair of pants from my pack and stood to walk into the woods to change. "Where are you going?" she asked, lacing up her boots and leaning in close to the burning tin on the log between us. "You're going to walk into the wet, rainy woods to change your pants? We're both adults, Garrett. I'll turn around so you can put your damn pants on. I laughed, and Georgia turned around, placing her hands exaggeratedly over her eyes. It was a struggle to balance on one leg as I pulled the mud-covered jeans around my ankles and nearly fell, only catching myself on the flimsy camping chair at the last moment. Georgia burst into laughter, and I turned to see an eye peeking out from between two of her fingers. She whistled suggestively, and I blushed, pulling on my dry jeans. Adults, huh? I said, presenting my best stern tone. Geez, a man can't stand half naked in the rain without being catcalled? She howled with laughter again and turned around. We ate peanut butter on saltine crackers around the burning can of fuel, and some warmth crept back into our bodies. Georgia said she figured it would take us a half hour to reach the stone cairn on our way to the chapel. With the muddy terrain, only another 15 minutes until we reached the Chapel of Truth. We folded the tarp, stowed our chairs, and set off under the dark clouds. We slogged through the mud under the trees for what felt like an hour before Georgia pointed ahead through the rain. I could see a clearing in the distance beyond the woodline. Our pace increased as we bounded toward the opening. Oh man, Georgia said as we stepped into a small treeless patch. Looks like a storm knocked a limb down on the cairn. A huge limb lay on the other side of the hollow, shards of limestone rocks scattered all around. Small white branches jutted out from the cluster of stones beneath the thickest section of wood. Georgia walked toward it, and I followed behind, scanning the clearing with exhaustion. The sun was beginning to sink low in the shortening day, and my interest in the cairn had become secondary to finding a phone for help. But Georgia had been so excited to show me, and I didn't want to disappoint her. We were only a few feet away when the debris pile finally came into focus. The stones were nearly a foot long and a half-foot wide, and the pieces of hardened clay that had once held them together were beginning to dissolve in the falling rain. Thick white branches jutted from the rocks, looking alien amongst the earthy tones. As we stood over the pile of wood and stone, I suddenly realized they weren't pale branches, but bones. Jagged remains of fibulas and tibias stood in the pile like ivory trees. Shattered pieces of the femur and pelvic bone coated the area like horrible snow. My stomach knotted at the strange sight, but I knelt to have a closer look. We better get moving to the chapel, Garrett, Georgia said, already beginning to walk away. It isn't far, but the mud is really slowing us down. We'll let the site admin know about the cairn, and they can contact the landowners. All right, let's go, I said, before the glint of metal caught my eye near the base of the cairn. I reached in, brushing away pebbles, and uncovered a knife. The blade was a rich violet with a deep groove on one side and Damascus ripples running its length, with a birchwood handle, smooth and unblemished. My index finger rubbed against the blade, nicking the skin and causing a small bead of blood to blossom. You coming? Georgia shouted, her voice growing further away. My hand trembled as the blade seemed to vibrate in my palm. The rippling pattern in the metal seemed to almost move, like wafts of heavy fog. A light hum was building in my mind as I fixated on that strange color. I'd never seen a knife like it. Colored blades weren't uncommon, but that didn't seem to be the case with this one. The hue was so deep, it seemed as if the metal had always been that same unnatural shade. Yeah! I shouted in response, lifting the knife and carefully wrapping it in a thick handkerchief before sliding it into my pocket. I stood again and began walking toward her, clutching the cloth-wrapped blade in my hand. Just had to tie my shoe. The rain was falling in heavier sheets the further we went. Georgia had seemed so sure that we were only a mile away from the Chapel of Truth, but after nearly an hour of toiling through the mud, there was no sign of civilization. I asked her a few times if we were getting close, and she assured me we were, but each time I asked, she seemed less certain. Her answers were getting shorter, and her tone was growing defensive. I'm sorry, Georgia, I said after she snapped at me for double-checking our direction again. I just thought we were closer than we are. It isn't helping anything to double-check every 5 minutes, Garrett, she said, turning over her shoulder to give me a disapproving look. We'll be there when? Georgia's words cut off as she stumbled and fell forward, throwing her hands in front of herself to brace the fall. I reached forward, missing the back of her jacket by an inch, and watched her tumble to the ground. There was a loud pop followed by an agonized scream. She was curled into the fetal position, left knee drawn to her chest and clutching her ankle. Her eyes were clenched shut, and she began breathing rapidly through her teeth. I knelt beside her and leaned her out of the mud onto my knee. Her skin had gone a pale white as she rocked herself back and forth in pain. Fighting the urge to reach for her leg, I waited for her breathing to calm. "Is it broken?" she asked without looking. "It feels broken. I can't tell while you're holding it," I said. "Can you stretch it out?" Her breathing smoothed a bit more, and she let her fingers uncouple from around her ankle. Slowly, she extended her leg, resting it in the mud, and painstakingly began the process of inching her pant leg above the boot. I carefully unlaced it and pulled the top of the boot away from the tongue, then slid the sock toward her ankle. She hissed in pain, but didn't tell me to stop, so I continued. Above the ball of her ankle, the skin was already swelling to a purplish black. The skin was so inflamed that I couldn't tell if it was broken or badly sprained. But the result was the same. Georgia wouldn't be walking out of those woods under her own power. And unless I found help soon, she might be in a greater deal of trouble than that. "What's the verdict, Doc?" she asked, sounding brave but agonized. "Am I going to lose the foot?" "Georgia? I can't tell," I said in a low tone. "Your skin's bulging above the ankle. Broken or not, you aren't walking anywhere. We need to set up camp and get you out of the rain. I'll go on and see if I can find the chapel. We'll come back and carry you out." We argued back and forth for a few minutes, Georgia wanting me to go, and me wanting to set up a camp to keep her dry. After some compromise, we settled on putting up a tarp and a chair to keep her dry and off the ground. I got to work immediately, securing the tie-downs to nearby trees before helping her as gently as I could from the ground into the chair, adding a small log to elevate her foot. I looked at her with worry as I prepared to continue on. "Just head north," she said, eyes clenched from the effort of movement. "I know I've said it so many times it makes you want to throw up, but we're almost there. It can't be more than 15 minutes. "All right," I said, reaching into my pack and pulling out my handgun. "Keep this, just in case." "In case of what, Garrett? Not much danger out here besides that rock that turned my ankle." I shrugged and smiled, almost telling her again of the terrible things I'd seen. "Just hang on to it. I'll be back soon, okay?" I don't know how much longer I walked through the woods, but the sun was sinking low by the time I spotted the first signs of the Chapel of Truth. The trees began to thin before breaking into an open patch of well-manicured grass. A few dim light bulbs burned in the distance, casting weak shadows of a high wrought iron gate on the wet ground. Large red brick pillars stood every 10 feet apart, stretching down the clearing and off into the distance. It was a relief to finally have arrived, but as I scanned the area beyond the fence, I saw no signs of life. There were no vehicles in sight. 5 or 6 cabins and a central building had no lights coming from inside, only the small, piercing glow of the 2 bulbs in front of what looked to be an old, careworn chapel. A dozen or more 3-foot piles of stone circled the old building. "Hello?" I shouted as I approached a small gate that connected to a gravel path. "Is anyone here? My friend is hurt and needs help. We don't have any cell signal and can't make it back to our car." Silence. I reached the gate and tried to pull it open, but a heavy internal latch held it firmly closed. Desperate, I shook it, hardly making it move, before I heard a soft tinkling noise above my head. Looking up, I saw a black bell shifting slightly from my violent struggle with the gate. The clapper inside barely grazed the side. A small rope dangled down. I grabbed it and began to pull harshly, breaking the agonizing silence of the darkening night. "Hello?" I shouted again, but the sound of the bell was washing it out. "Is anyone there?" A light burst to life through the windows of one of the cabins, and a dark silhouette appeared behind the foggy glass. I waved my hands above my head and rang the bell again before they moved away from the window. The sound of an old door hinge squealed, and I could see someone walking onto the porch of the cabin, cast dimly in the shine of the chapel lights. "Good evening, stranger," a smooth voice called from the dark. "Stop ringing the bell if you could. We've just finished dinner. Most everyone is in the chapel for evening observance. We don't want to disturb them." The man strode across the grass, rain pelting down on him, but he moved with no sense of urgency. As he grew closer, I could see that he was middle-aged and thin-framed, with a long beard and dark brown hair pulled up into a ponytail. He wore a button-down shirt open to his sternum and a pair of weathered jeans draped over the top of leather boots. When he reached the gate, he pulled an ancient key loop from a clip on his belt and opened the latch of the gate. "What seems to be the trouble, traveler?" he asked in a welcoming tone. "Not much of a night to be out for a hike." "My name's Garrett Parker," I said, panting from the effort of the hike. "My friend and I were caught out in the storm and couldn't make it back to our car. She's hurt, a few miles from here, and we need help. Do you have a phone I could use to call?" The man stood for a moment, absorbing my panicked words, and smiled. "Sure," he exclaimed. "We've got a phone in the chapel, but we can't interrupt the service. It'll only be 5 or 10 more minutes before they're finished. Step into my cabin and get warmed by the fire while we wait. Once they're done, you can call for help, and I'll have some of the other tenders go retrieve your friend while you wait for someone to pick you up." He stood aside and gestured up the gravel path toward the cabin he had come from. I nodded gratefully and started toward it. The man closed the gate behind us and locked it with the old key loop, then turned to follow after me. "Do you think we could go ahead and call?" I asked, looking at the man who now walked beside me. My mind swam with visions of Georgia sitting pained in the fading daylight, waiting for me to return with help. "I hate to interrupt your service, but my friend is hurt pretty badly, and I don't really want to leave her out there any longer than I have to." "It'll only be a few more minutes now," he replied. "The tenders only meet for worship twice a week, and I really don't want to rob them of their joy. Just be patient. Step inside and get warm. We will call soon." We reached the cabin porch, and I walked forward, seeing the small light from a hearth fire inside. Just the sight of it filled my body with warmth, and I told myself that a few more minutes would be fine. I reached to push the cabin door open when I heard the man's boots meet the wood of the porch. They were slow at first, but suddenly they were hammering hard against the wooden planks. I turned as quickly as I could, but it was already too late. The man's eyes gleamed madly in the firelight as he brought a piece of firewood down on my head. When I came to, there was a disconnected sensation between my mind and the rest of my body. I was awake, but none of my senses seemed to cooperate with the others. I could feel the pain in my head, but my body wouldn't move. My nose was filled with the heavy smell of copper, but no air seemed to pull in with each breath. Chattering voices and tinny music filled my ears, but the language and melodies made no sense. My eyes struggled to open as if I had to break through a hard crust to see. The red hue of blood fogged my vision, and I tried to blink it away, revealing a dim room lit only with incandescent bulbs dangling from wires above me. The walls of the room were earthen, thick roots jutting out like clawing fingers reaching toward me. A half-dozen people stood around the room, backs turned toward a figure sitting against the far wall. Their features were hazy and indistinguishable. They were swaying side to side, keeping time with a haunting melody coming from the seated man. His arms were bent and moving rapidly with the music, holding something against his neck. I blinked a few more times, clearing away the red cloud from my eyes until I could make out what he was holding. It was a violin. The music was intoxicating. Rather than wanting to fight or scream, my body began to sway as well. My previously motionless hands lifted as though attached to strings, drifting above my head and opening my palms toward the dirt ceiling. I had felt like this before, something like it anyway. Not exactly the same, but a memory lurked in a corner of my mind that made me feel I knew the sensation, like I knew the song. The violinist was playing the melody of the Whistlers in Arlo Bennett National Park. My eyes were closed, and I was turning my head to the ceiling when my senses seemed to return all at once. My head throbbed, and there was a sudden surge of pain in my legs, like I'd left them too close to a campfire for too long. They were burning, but unable to move from the source. I looked down to see a pile of stones stacked to my waist. There was wet, glistening clay between them. Surrounding the pile of stone was a small fire, crackling and drying the earth and grout. Thin wisps of steam floated away from the crevices as they hardened into place. While I struggled, the music stopped. As I fought to free myself, the man seated against the far wall lowered the violin to his lap. "It appears our friend is awake," he said. His voice was dry, like two pieces of sandpaper running together. "I'm afraid my tenders have taken you all for naught. Though the grove is full and the harvest is ripe, tonight the Master opens a new doorway through me, and you will bear witness to his power. The world has taken much from me, but I have given so much more than I could have ever hoped for." My eyes fixed on him, coming into focus. Thick brambles of white hair and beard blanketed his shoulders and chest. His skin was bone white, traced with thick purple veins. Ragged clothes drooped from his thin frame, looking molded and moth-eaten. Low to the ground, I could see that he wasn't sitting, but had fused with the earth and floor below. His waist bloomed into a gray, pulsating mass with thick, quivering roots that ran down the center of the room toward me. I followed the roots as they ran around the base of the still hardening car and looked over my shoulder. My vision was blocked by the red curtain again, and I lifted an arm to wipe it away. My hand came back covered with blood, oozing from the gash where the man had struck me with the split log. When I could finally see again, I screamed. Only feet behind me, there were nearly 24 stone cars. Sprouting from the top of them, with arms and heads extended toward the ceiling, were emaciated people swaying to the music that was no longer playing. Their skin was stretched tightly over their bones, making them look like living skeletons. Their jaws hung open in an unheard moan. Among them were 6 short figures, no taller than 4 or 5 feet, but they somehow looked older than the rest. The 6 children, taken by Elias Brown almost a century ago. Held in place by the stone cars, they stood just as the forest of men and women I had seen at the top of the staircase I found in Arlo Bennett. "Their sacrifice has sustained me and strengthened me," Elias said. "It has allowed me to become the seedling that will open a new gate for the one we serve." Elias stopped for a moment, lifting his head and sniffing the air. "You have the smell of another world, young man," the old man I now recognized as Elias Brown said. "What a joy for you, then, to be here to see the birth of a new bridge to our amethyst master. He sees through my eyes, and I feel his hunger for you. Oh yes, you closed one of his doorways, and he is not pleased. Be patient, for soon I will open a new channel to his world, and an emissary will take you to him." Elias lifted his fiddle from his lap, tucked it under his bony chin, and brought the bow across the strings. "In this earth and cellar's shadows twist, my ancient fiddle by darkness kissed. Strings hum with secrets, aged and wise. New doors will open to eldritch skies. Beneath the cellar, earth and veil, I play the notes of a darkened tale. A portal yawns where nightmares creep, releasing evil from its sleep. In the fiddle's sway, the eldritch delight, a portal widens as comes his might. A servant am I to secrets concealed, in the cell's depths is woe revealed." He dropped the fiddle, and his body began to shudder. The gray mass at his hip began to pulse and ripple like a cocoon near to bursting. I struggled against the rocks around my legs and began pushing them away one by one, my body now under my control again. Stones tumbled into the fire as Elias Brown began to moan and shriek. His body started to stretch, longer and thinner, as I continued pushing the car stones away. "Stop him, fools!" erupted a deep, clear voice from Elias. His eyes were now glowing a low purple as his limbs elongated toward the ceiling. "Subdue him!" The 6 men and women standing in front of Elias turned and began to run toward me, sliding knives from sheaths on their belts. I tried to hurry, knocking rocks away at a faster pace, but the lower I reached, the harder the clay had become. The heated rocks were beginning to burn my hands, and I was sure they would be on me before I could free myself. The man who had met me at the gate was out front, a sadistic gleam in his eye. He held a knife above his head, glittering in the electric glow, preparing to bring it down on me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the strange violet blade I'd found at the base of the shattered car. It thrummed with energy in my palm. Slipping it out, I held it in front of me just as rapid thunderclaps exploded behind me. Gunshots. One of the man's eyes vanished, replaced with a bleeding maw, leaving the other questioning what had happened. The two cultists behind me dropped to the floor quickly after. 3 remained of their original group, confused and searching for the source of the barrage. A woman, savagely jerking her head from side to side, fell backward as a blossom of blood covered her white work shirt. The man to her left clutched his stomach after another deafening roar and dropped to his knees, looking down at the blood pouring from between his fingers. Only one man remained, eyes now locked on something behind me. The madness seemed to drift away. Instead, looking remorseful, he held his hands to his sides in a gesture of peace and began to walk toward me. A few steps away, he arched the knife above his head before a final blast sounded over my shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground atop one of the others. I turned to see Georgia, my handgun leveled at the chaos before her. She was panting and wide-eyed, shaking mildly. A crude splint was on her broken ankle, thick oak branches cinched together with a belt. Her knees quaked, and she leaned back against the wall, her feet on 2 different steps leading toward the main level. "Carrot," she questioned. "What the hell is this? They were going to kill you." "You gotta get out of here," I said, managing to kick the last of the rocks around my feet free. I pointed toward the thin, writhing creature at the end of the cellar. "I've got to try to stop this thing, but you've got to go. Now. Don't stop until you get to the main road." Georgia's eyes were filled with tears, looking from me back to the stretching, writhing old man. She took one lurching step back toward the main level and stopped. Kneeling down, she lifted my gun again and fired wildly toward Elias. The bullets mostly peppered the wall behind him, but the 2 that found their target seemed to have no more effect than the bite of a mosquito. He was so tall now that his head was beginning to press through the ceiling as the gray mound below him ruptured, sending sulfur-smelling pus across the floor. "Go now!" I screamed. She shook her head, but began to pull herself up the stairs and out of sight. I turned back toward Elias, who had now almost broken through the ceiling completely. His body had become so thin that it had taken on the look of a spiraling corkscrew made of thick, bumpy vertebral bones. My God, I thought. He's not opening a portal. He's turning into a staircase. I ran forward and jumped onto the ascending mass of flesh and bone, climbing as quickly as I could. Above me, I could see Elias's scarecrow arms and terrible face lifting through the first floor of the chapel and bursting through the ceiling. There had to be a way to stop him, but there was no way I would be able to climb to the top. He was through the chapel ceiling by then, lifting me up into the rainy night. Water pelted me as my grip began to slide. I threw my arms around the curling bone, clinging helplessly to it. One foot managed to find purchase between 2 shifting vertebrae, and I stabilized myself. We were nearly 30 feet from the ground by then, and I felt sure that Elias would keep lifting me into the sky until he ripped a hole into that nightmare dimension and pulled me through with him. I was still clutching the violet knife in my hand and looked at the expanding tissue between the vertebral bones. With no other options, I unwrapped my right arm from the snaking column, drove the point of the knife into the seam, and gave it a twist. Our upward movement halted, and a howl filled my ears so loud I nearly let go altogether to cover them. Looking up, I saw Elias's purple eyes glaring back at me. "Where did you get that?" he roared, doubling over his spiraling body and descending toward me. His lanky arms reached down, fingers tipped with bone-white claws. Both eyes were now burning with purple flames, locked on the dagger in my hand. "You should not have such a thing." I began to climb down the curling spine, but it was no use. The monstrous visage was growing closer by the moment. The rain had covered the spiraling body, and I slipped, failing to find my footing. I tilted backward, falling toward the ground. I watched as Elias plummeted toward me. Just before I hit the ground, his long, terrible fingers wrapped around me, whipping my body through the air as he pulled me toward his face. "Give that to me," he hissed, the last traces of humanity fading from his frame. "You should not have such." As Elias brought me to his face, his jaws unhinging into a chasm of serrated teeth, I shoved the violet blade into his eye with all my remaining strength. His grip released as I fell the remaining 5 feet to the ground. I landed with a sickening crunch, feeling the vibration of breaking ribs ripple up my side. Above me, Elias thrashed and shrieked, batting his monstrous hands at the blade protruding from his eye. Purple fog drifted from his screaming mouth, and the skeletal coil began to diminish, drawing back into the ground like a retreating snake. One of his white talons struck the blade, knocking it from his eye socket and sending it flying into the forest beside the chapel gate. I watched as Elias grew nearer to the hole in the chapel floor. Once again, a shriveled and elderly man, his remaining eye locked with mine, and stared at me with a fury I knew belonged to something from another world. The purple light sparked, dimmed, and vanished. His withered hand loosened its grip on the floorboard of the chapel, and he fell back into the darkness of the cellar. I lay there on my side, rain falling through the hole in the roof, breathing raggedly and feeling darkness rolling over my eyes. They were nearly closed when a voice, sounding small and distant, called my name. I was too tired to answer. I just wanted to sleep. Smack. The side of my face bloomed with pain, and I could hear someone calling my name again, but I still didn't answer. Smack. "Garrett Parker, get the hell up! We've got to go! Something is happening down there!" I opened my eyes to see Georgia McDonald standing over me, wet hair dangling from her head. Her eyes looked scared but determined. She was tugging at the collar of my jacket, trying to pull me into a sitting position. She was pointing at the hole in the floor with the other hand. A wellspring of purple light was beginning to flow from the cellar, growing brighter with every second. "We've got to move, Garrett. Please." I pushed myself from the ground with her help, the feeling of 1,000 shards of glass stabbing into my side. We began to shuffle toward the gate, Georgia leaning heavily on me to take the weight off her ankle. The air was beginning to hum, and the purple light had grown so bright the outline of the clearing was as visible as a clear afternoon. Our feet began to shake, and the earth rumbled lightly. A swell of light filled our eyes, and we were jettisoned forward, sprawling into the trees. Much like after my fall from the staircase in Arlo Bennett National Forest, everything went black. I spent a few days in the hospital again, but I knew this time I had no explanation that would satisfy my superiors. Nurses came in and out throughout the day, but none of them would answer my questions. How long had I been there? Was Georgia okay? What had happened to the Chapel of Truth? Most of the days were silent. There was no television in the room. A phone was mounted on the wall by the door, but I was in too much pain to imagine going to it. Only the steady beep of vital signs monitors kept me company. I was dozing in the afternoon when I heard a man's voice outside the door in the hallway. All of my nurses had been female so far, and I hadn't seen any doctors, so I assumed one of them was finally going to come talk to me and tell me when I would be released. His voice was deep and familiar, though, and I felt certain I had met its owner before. The door opened, and a man stepped inside. He was wearing a green pair of pants and a jacket with a matching tie over a khaki button-up shirt. A khaki hat was tucked under his arm, leaving his salt and pepper hair visible under the harsh light of the room. He smiled at me, but there was a great amount of concern behind it. "Mr. Parker," he said firmly, "I see that you still enjoy leaving your posts in a state of disarray." It was Dennis Garland, the director I had worked for at Arlo Bennett National Forest. "Mr. Garland," I muttered. "What are you doing here, sir?" "I've been in meetings discussing your recent activities." Miss McDonald, your friend from LBL, has been sharing some strange and upsetting accounts of what happened to the two of you. Our search and rescue team found you both in quite a strange condition. Mr. Garland, I can explain. Georgia doesn't. You don't need to explain anything, Mr. Parker. There's a story running on the local news stations and in the papers today explaining that the Chapel of Truth property was swallowed in a sinkhole caused by an unmapped coal mining tunnel in the region. No survivors were recovered, despite the noble efforts of yourself and Miss McDonald. My head swam, and I thumbed the plunger in my hand, sending a wave of pain medication into my veins. I don't get it, I said, looking at him with bewilderment. A cover-up? Do you recommend we tell the public Miss McDonald's account of events? He asked curtly. No, I replied. She's telling the truth, sir. At least part of it. There's more to the story if you'll give me a chance to explain. Mr. Parker, you'll have a great deal of time to explain everything you know. When you're released from the hospital, you and Georgia McDonald will report to me. Some concerning things have come to light, and I believe the two of you may be uniquely suited to assist. I thumbed the plunger again, knowing it wouldn't deliver any more medication, but hoping it would malfunction and send me into a drug-induced slumber, away from all this strangeness. Mr. Garland walked toward me and pulled a cell phone from his pocket. He sat on the bed beside me and opened YouTube. He pulled up his saved videos tab and clicked the one at the top. The channel's name was National Park Mysteries, and the title of the video read, Missing Man Discovered in the Forest After 18-Month Disappearance. The video, a shaky clip recorded on a cell phone, showed 4 National Forest Service workers surrounding a man as he stepped out of a Jeep and headed toward a ranger cabin. His red hair was dirty and matted. A loose green jacket hung from his shoulders, and he walked hunched over, staring at the ground. Whoever was recording began asking the man where he had been and what had happened to him. When he looked into the camera, his eyes were wild and pleading. He began to walk toward the camera person, holding his palms to the sky. My name is Gary Vincent. My name is Gary Vincent. Do you know Garrett Parker? I saw him, but he got away. He made it back. Yes, he did. You know where to find him. I have to talk to him now. Garrett Parker, please. I have to see him. The 4 NFS workers took hold of Gary and directed him into the cabin before the video ended. Mr. Garland thumbed the lock button on his phone, and the screen went black, but I could only stare at my reflection in the glass. I had no words. Garrett, Mr. Garland said softly, we need your help. None of us understand this, but we're going to have to get a handle on it. Pretty damn quick. He stood and headed toward the door, but stopped and turned back toward me. I almost forgot, he said, stopping at the edge of the bed. He pulled something from his pocket and set it on the bedside table. When I looked it over, I saw the violet blade and birch handle shining in the hard white light. Did a little bit of studying on that while you were under. I think you'll need it. When can I see Georgia? I asked before he made it to the door. As soon as you're released, he said, turning the handle and standing in the doorway. She'll meet you. Where? I asked. Your new post, he said. You and Miss McDonald will be reassigned to Arlo Bennett National Forest. Our base of operations will be Fire Tower number 1. The door slammed behind him. That's it for tonight's story. I hope everybody enjoyed it. This is going to be an ongoing series written by Grip14, especially for this channel, so huge thanks to Grip14 for crafting this tale. There is a prequel to this series that you can find linked in the bottom right-hand corner of this video and at the very end, in the last 10 seconds or so. If you haven't seen the Fire Tower 1 story, it serves as a preamble to this one and sets the tone for what's to come. A man once paid me to be hunted for sport. I had stumbled across his post when I was browsing the web for work. I was looking for some sort of side gig to pass the time. I was at a bit of a crossroads in my life. I had quit my previous job to break away from the redundancy it had sucked me into. It was a spontaneous decision with no real-life planning. Luckily, in this day and age, the internet caters to people like me. People who don't care about chasing money or don't want to be tied down. It wasn't the money I was after, but the change it would provide. I felt like I couldn't enjoy anything in life, like I was just going through the motions. That night, I had been scrolling for quite some time, skimming over job posts, help wanted here, shorthanded there. I didn't think I would find anything that would suit me. It all seemed like the same thing disguised under a different title. That was until I found this particular ad. I thought it was a scam at first, comical dollar signs on each side of the Craigslist title, like a trap set for the elderly in search of credit card numbers. I clicked on it anyway, curiosity getting the better of me. In all caps, the posting read, "Big money for manhunt volunteers." At least it was to the point. The details below gave a brief introduction as to what the job entailed. I skimmed them over with amusement, half of me doubting if it was true, the other half kind of hoping it was. As ridiculous as the prospect was, I had to admit it was exciting. There were some requirements for the job, however, and I was surprised to find that I fit the bill. Must be male. Must be young and fit if possible. Must not be afraid of the dark. Must come alone. No cell phones, no firearms, no police. Must meet the night before to discuss further. The list went on for a while, but ultimately ended with a phone number and a typed signature from someone simply named Bob. I found myself thinking it over. I didn't exactly have anything to lose, no family or friends. I always lived alone. The idea of wanting to pack up at a moment's notice never seemed to sit well with any of the significant others I had in the past. I don't know if it was stupidity or the need for adventure, but in the end, I found myself grabbing my phone. I mean, how often do people get to say they were hunted for sport? The money wouldn't hurt either. I gave him a ring. The man who answered the call was tipsy but eager, and when I mentioned my interest in his post, he seemed to be ecstatic, like I was calling to give him the lead role in a movie. The conversation was a little awkward considering the reasoning behind the call itself, but after a few minutes of cryptic back and forth, we agreed on a meeting place. I was a few towns away, but he insisted I meet him closer to his side of the woods. The hunt would be at his estate, and I should stay in town so I was well rested for the event. We would meet at a local bar called the Sixth Shot to discuss terms and conditions. He seemed determined, like he had been waiting for someone for a while. He said he would understand if I was in no hurry, but with my current status of unemployment and lack of overall plans, I found myself meeting his energy. I had to admit the concept was a little exciting, if it was real at all. We decided to meet the next day. The Sixth Shot was a bustling little place. A neon sign with a smoking gun made it easy to find. When I arrived, I found the guy immediately. He looked about how you'd expect a manhunter to look. He pulled it off well. A black polo and tan cargos, a shiny shaved head with a thick curled mustache, all worn on a very tan and muscular body. He was sitting at the bar alone, and he lit up like a Christmas tree when he saw me. Like he knew. He patted the stool next to him like he was welcoming a long-lost friend. When I crossed the bar, I was met with a firm handshake and a pat on the shoulder. He told me he was delighted to meet me, and drinks were on him. After a brief introduction, he got a glass of top-shelf bourbon for himself, while I sipped on an Irish red ale. I had acquired a taste for it recently. Considering he was trying to hire me with the intent to murder me, he sounded like a pretty cool guy. We got to know each other a little before getting to the serious stuff. The people around, enjoying their drinks, were none the wiser. The man known as Bob was actually Robert Callahan, a man born into a world of wealth and, as it seemed, perpetual boredom. His father ran a very successful chain of automotive stamping companies that he inherited from his grandfather. By the time his father passed, there were so many buildings and people assigned to making the gears turn efficiently across the globe without his input. He was able to live a life of leisure on a 7-figure income without as much as lifting a finger. The companies ran themselves as he got older, and he filled his adult years with seeking thrills across the globe. He tried anything that got his adrenaline pumping, from skydiving to whitewater rafting. He took a liking to hunting, which he said had started an escapade of finding the world's most dangerous predators and killing them, no matter the cost. He said he had seen it all, but in all his years, there was one thing he hadn't bagged: a human. I laughed at his extraordinary lifestyle, feeling a bit mundane when it was my turn to share stories. Mine was far from exciting. I left the more boring bits out, but I told him I spent most of my 20s as a park ranger. It kept me close to nature and the outdoors, but when it's all you look at, it tends to lose its luster. I left that to be a cab driver in a big city, something that kept me in transit and entertained for a while. Always moving, with so many people to observe in the busy city life. But in time, I found myself too contained to the city itself, which is why I recently quit. This brings me to about where I was right now, discussing being hunted by another man. He was fascinated, jotting down notes in a little pocketbook while he sipped his bourbon. We conversed for a time. I finished a couple of beers, and he ordered another pour of bourbon. The conversation was nice. It had been a while since the last time I went out with friends. Despite the fun I was having, we couldn't beat around the bush forever. When it came time to discuss the actual terms of our agreement, his face turned serious. I would be paid $5,000 tonight. Granted, I still wanted to go through with it. He said this would help me settle accounts before the event. He said he owned a mansion outside of town with over 30 acres of forest land. He was outside city limits. His nearest neighbor was 6 miles away. No one would hear screams or gunshots. We would start tomorrow night. I was supposed to get to his estate at 10 p.m. After my arrival, I would get 15 minutes to head into the forest as a head start. He explained when the 15 minutes were up, he would promptly signal with a flare. If I had any second thoughts, I needed to address them and withdraw from the woods before the signal. If I was still in the woods when the flare went off, I would be shot on sight. He said I would be paid $10,000 an hour if I survived. The hunt would go on until dawn, and if I was still alive come daybreak, I would be free. He would be armed with a hunting rifle and a combat knife. I would be armed with my wits. It was evident it wasn't in his plans for me to survive. But that was something I had already come to terms with. He studied my face when he said these things, perhaps trying to gauge my reaction. I tried my best to play it cool, despite being a little nervous. "Does any of this bother you?" he eventually asked, downing the last of his drink. "No, not really. I've always just tried to go with the flow. Doing that made me stumble upon your offer. Maybe if I get out and live a little, it'll encourage me to settle down for a bit more. That is, if I make it out alive." I winked, and we both had a laugh. "You're a riot. If I wasn't trying to kill you, I think we'd be pretty good friends." After all the details were ironed out, he paid the tab, and it was time for us to take our leave. We shook on it before going our separate ways. He was excited for the next day, a pep in his step carrying him to his obnoxiously lifted truck. He burned out as he left, almost rear-ending a Buick as he left the parking lot. I watched him go, feeling oddly serene in the cool night air. It was hard to describe. There was no one waiting for me to come back, no one to give me a courtesy call if I didn't show up. I didn't know if it was the thrill of the challenge or the drastic break in monotony. I spent my life trying not to be a creature of habit. Maybe this would be the last shift off course, or maybe tomorrow I would die and not have to worry about it anymore. With the moon shining bright and the cool breeze on my neck, I decided I would take a walk before sleeping in my car for the night. It might be my last time to enjoy a night like this. The next day, I woke in the backseat of my car, feeling oddly rejuvenated despite my choice of bed for the night. Through the blinding afternoon rays, I found my phone and checked my bank account. He was a man of his word. The $5,000 had been wired as promised. I decided I would go into town, indulge in some of the local variety, and find a place to shower before meeting Robert at the estate. I climbed into the front seat and left the parking lot on my way into town. I called my landlord and canceled my lease. I was already living in and out of boxes, and my lease was month to month, so I wouldn't exactly be missed. After getting something to eat, I called and canceled all my utility accounts, electricity, internet, stuff like that. I had already put in my resignation at the cab company. There wasn't really any ties to my life at my apartment. I would either survive till dawn and get the biggest payday of my life, or not have to worry about the next step if I failed. Either way, this was the end of the current chapter of my life. After spending the day driving around town, I found myself heading over to Robert's property. The sun was already making its way into the horizon. His driveway was long and winding, leading to a gigantic house that looked like the surrounding forest was trying to swallow it. When I pulled up, it was already almost dark. A butler greeted me at the mansion, an old man carrying a silver tray covered in a soft cloth. He opened the car door and let me out, introducing himself only as Charles. "I will be taking your belongings now," he said. "If you don't make it out, they'll be destroyed at sunrise." He held out the tray. "Of course," I said, handing over my phone, wallet, and keys. After placing them on the tray, he offered a smile. "Would you like a refreshment before heading in? Mr. Callahan's staff will accommodate you before heading into the forest. He truly appreciates you answering his ad." "I'm fine. Thank you. I guess I'd rather just get to it," I said, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. "Of course. If you'll just follow me, it's right this way." He gestured for me to follow him. Charles escorted me through the house. The inside was furnished top to bottom with luxurious wooden furniture, bearskin rugs, chandeliers made of gold, and paintings from the Renaissance era. The estate was definitely worth a fortune. We passed by a trophy room filled wall to wall with mounts of animals from across the globe. They seemed to stare with their glass eyes, following us as we made our way through. Charles made no effort to engage in conversation, and neither did I. The other end of the mansion consisted of a large patio waiting for us. There was Robert, who seemed to be preparing for a little hunt. He was running a large combat knife over a whetstone slowly and methodically as we approached. Propped up next to him was a rifle, the bolt pulled back, several cartridges laid out on the glass table next to it, and the flare gun. "The time is approaching," said Charles, and Robert nodded. He wiped the blade off and sheathed it on his belt. I looked at his loadout on the table, starting to feel sick to my stomach. This was seriously happening. Now that I was here and seeing him fully prepared, I couldn't help but feel like I was in over my head. Robert stood and grabbed his rifle. He picked up each .308 cartridge and loaded them slowly, one at a time, until it was full. He racked the bolt forward, slung the rifle on his shoulder, and grabbed the flare gun. 15 minutes. Then flare, he said. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, twirling the flare gun on his finger. "No, not really," I said, making my way off the patio. I wasn't exactly sure what to say in a situation like this, so I figured it was best just to get going. "Excellent. I'll see you on the other side," he saluted me, and Charles gave me a nod. I turned and left the patio, making my way into the woods. Each step got heavier as I approached the trees, the darkness behind them getting eerier the closer I got. When I reached the tree line, I looked back at the mansion. Robert and Charles just watched expectantly. I swallowed and ducked in, feeling the full weight of my decision, perhaps a little too late. Once the mansion was no longer visible, I started jogging. I was mindful of my footsteps. A stray log or vine could trip me up. During my time as a park ranger, I spent dozens of hours hiking trails. I would survey the land weekly, picking up discarded things like trash and lost clothing. This landscape was much different, however. The ground was uneven. Years of collecting leaves, buried and fallen limbs, and jagged rocks. I was wearing decent boots, but the terrain was unforgiving. One misplaced step, and I could roll or break an ankle. I wouldn't be able to rush too much, so I maintained a steady pace, hoping to put enough distance between us and maybe find a decent place to hide. With the sunset and no light source, I couldn't see very far in front of me. I tried not to think about how much time had passed. I just focused on pushing forward. The trees started to crowd, giant maples with lush branches blocking the moonlight. I ducked under them quickly. A twisted branch snagged my shirt, and I shook it loose. Birds screeched and roused from their perch, flapping away in a panic at my presence, their cries echoing into the night, sending a chill down my spine. There's nothing to be afraid of, I thought to myself. Not yet, at least. I came to a small clearing and took a second to catch my breath. I leaned on a tree, shaking clumps of mud and pine needles from my boots. The ground was wetter than I had anticipated. Off in the distance behind me, there was an echoing pop, and I looked to see the flare reaching toward the sky, a little orange ball of fire. I pushed off the tree and continued. I had to keep moving. I ran across the clearing, each step squished on the ground as I went on. My third stride, my boot stepped on something awkward and hard. By the time I heard the clicking sound, I knew it was already too late. The sudden force clamped down on both sides of my ankle. I could do nothing but cry in pain. I stumbled awkwardly to the ground, agony shooting through my leg as the wind was knocked out of me. I looked down at the bear trap, blood oozing from where the metal jaws were buried. I was frustrated at my foolishness. Of course, he had put traps in the woods. Why wouldn't he? I forced the jaws apart, the mechanism creaking, begging to bite down again. My hands shook, holding the slippery metal, and my leg was barely free. I let it snap shut. The sound of steel on steel clanked into the night, so loud it bounced off the trees. A second later, I heard an excited whooping noise. I'd heard him. He would be coming. I tried to see my ankle in the dark. There were nasty gashes on either side, but I didn't think it was broken. I got back up. It would hold weight. It was just hurting like hell. I didn't want to look back when I pushed forward, panic starting to set in, trying to regulate my breathing. I moved as quickly as I could, one strong step, one baby limp. I scanned the ground, looking for more traps. There had to be more, surely. Branches whipped my cheeks and pulled at my clothes. I tried to be more careful, but I just couldn't see them quick enough. My left foot squelched with every step, blood soaking through my sock into the laces. I pressed on, hurdling a large dead log. I had to find a spot to hide for a moment to catch my breath. My heart was racing. I was having trouble thinking rationally as I could with the situation. A wave of fear washed over me for the first time in a long time. I'd gotten what I wanted, a thrill to make me feel alive. But as I looked down at my mangled leg, I was starting to regret it. Gunfire cracked in the distance. Branches next to my ear exploded, specks of bark and dust hitting my face from the racing bullet. I threw myself to the ground and started crawling, dragging my injured ankle with me. I dragged myself to a large pine tree and sat behind it, trying to come up with a plan. The gun went off again, closer this time. The round punched into the tree, shaking loose needles that fell from above. I squinted in the dark, trying to see ahead. In front of me, the ground started to slope, and I could finally make out the sound of rushing water. It could be a creek or a small river. Keeping behind the large pine, I slowly stood, trying to stick to the shadows until I was ready. I pushed off and started to run for the slope, hearing the gunfire again. As soon as I was in view, a fierce pain ripped through my shoulder, and my arm went limp, but I wouldn't stop. I started down the hill. I could see the shimmering surface of the creek below, something bobbing in the water, rotted logs from the looks of it. I needed to get down there, get under the water, and use the logs as cover. I worked my way down the slope. The ground was wet, each step threatening to slide out from underneath me. I heard footsteps now, breaking sticks and brushing trees as they tried to catch up. Another gunshot. The bullet whizzed over my head and missed. I tried to go down further and crouched, but my feet were too unstable. I focused on the water, a little bit closer and closer, like it was my salvation. I was almost there. Behind me, I could hear the racking of the bolt-action rifle. I shot a panicked look behind me. I could barely see him working through the trees, 20 yards away. As I turned back to the creek, my good foot got caught on something. I fell forward, hit the ground hard, and started to roll painfully and awkwardly in the dark. I watched my descent in a swirl of moonlight and darkness, my elbows and knees colliding with the earth as I went. I came to a stop at the edge of the water, lying on my back, gasping for air. I barely moved, my vision spinning as I looked up at the sky. I could hear him coming down the hill slowly and carefully. He knew he had won. He was taking his time now. Exhausted and defeated, I looked at the creek. It wasn't logs I had seen floating. Bodies. Several of them, bloating and rotting in the clear glow of the moon. I looked around. The more I saw, men, women, children. Robert was there now, boots squishing as he looked down at me. A pair of black goggles were over his eyes, a wicked grin on his face. He unslung his rifle and let it fall to the ground, then pulled the goggles off his face and cast them aside like toys. Disappointing. Very disappointing. I thought with you being a park ranger and all, you'd make it further. But here we are, at the creek. They never make it past the creek. Robert cracked his knuckles and pulled the knife from his belt. He held the knife in both hands and brought it down, aiming for my heart. I put up my hands to fight him, but it only delayed the inevitable. He worked free from my grasp and elbowed me in the head. My vision blurred once more. My arms went slack as he buried the knife in my chest. My lung collapsed as the blade went in, and with a grunt, he pulled the blade down, separating my torso down the middle in a nasty gushing mess. Satisfied, he got up and left me there to die. I tried to talk, but it all came out as gurgled whispers. What was that? He mocked, and he knelt to hear me. With the last of my breath, I spoke my final 2 words, just loud enough for him to hear. Involuntary screams came next, loud and shrill, broken vocal cords shouting in a mixture of barking and screeching. With both hands, I pulled the large incision, yanking the flesh apart in a spray of blood and disintegrating organs. His reaction was the same as all others before him, a look of pure irrational fear. My thin, inky black limbs burst from the gaping wound in my torso. I was on him in an instant, slashing the knife away and digging my nails into his flesh. I ripped his shirt like paper and separated his chest just like he did to me, my piercing screeches ringing into the night until I burrowed so deep they could no longer be heard. He thrashed and oozed from every orifice as he made room for me, just as the cab driver did, and the park ranger before him. I ate and wriggled as he expired, worming and digging my tiny frame to each limb like a suit. When the fit was just right, I stood up and cracked my knuckles. I looked at my reflection in the water, running a hand over my new face to feel the fit. Better than the last one, for sure. I took my time going back to the estate, making sure my walk was just right and everything was in place. The hours passed as I settled in, feeling more and more at home as I worked the joints and muscles. At daybreak, I emerged from the tree line to find Charles on the patio waiting. He came to greet me immediately. "Sir, this one had you out all night. Was this one better than the others? Can I get you something to drink?" "Oh, much better than the last," I replied. "A bourbon, if you will." I've been a fire lookout for about a year now. I spend most of my life alone in a small, window-lined, one-room shack atop a steel and wood-frame tower in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My only companions are my collection of cheap novels, a laptop computer with infrequent and unreliable internet service, and the two-way radio I use to communicate with the few nearby towers and ranger stations. Nearby is a bit of a misnomer, though. Using my high-powered binoculars, I can just barely make out Tower 12 on a clear day, situated several miles to my west. Tower 15, the next nearest to my location, only appears as a glint of sunlight to my east when the sun catches it just right. I've been told the Parks Department intends to put up some additional towers in this area as soon as it gets the necessary funding, which is probably no time soon. That's fine with me, though. I like the solitude. It helps quiet my mind, keeps the memories at bay. Mostly, I occupy my days either with simple maintenance in and around the tower or scanning the dense trees all around me for any signs of trouble. It's been a dry year, so the threat of fire is a constant one. This particular afternoon, I was clearing some brush from around the base of the tower that had begun to encroach on the fire road leading back to the nearby ranger station 20 miles away. Even with the heavy suspension of the government-issued Jeep, the road was a harsh ride at the best of times. I had just finished dragging some brush cuttings off into the tree line when the radio clipped to my belt squawked. Tower 9. This is Tower 12. Do you copy? It was Billy Johnson, my supervisor. Nice enough guy, I suppose. Tended to leave me alone most of the time. I straightened up and stretched my back, wiping the sweat from my eyes with my forearm and keyed the microphone attached to my shoulder. Go for Tower 9, I replied as I replaced the shears and bow saw into the small storage shed near the base of the stairs. John, do you have eyes on a bit of smoke north of your position? Stand by, Billy, I said, snatching up my water bottle and jogging to the metal staircase that wound its way around the tower. I didn't bother locking the 8-foot chain-link fence surrounding my little compound. Chances were I'd be back soon enough. Reaching the top, I stepped through the trapdoor and onto the walkway that circled the cabin, closing it behind me. It was habit at this point. The last thing I needed was to take an errant step and tumble down through the open hatch. I'd probably end up breaking my neck. As I passed by, I reached into the open door of the shack and grabbed the binoculars hanging on a nearby hook. Rounding the railed corner of the walkway and turning my attention to the dark green blanket of trees stretching out before me, I saw the smoke almost instantly. A thin trickle of wispy white haze rose lazily above the canopy some distance off. Probably just some campers, I figured, though there weren't any approved campsites in that area. We always had more than a few folks each season who decided that camping off-trail in the deep bush sounded like quite a hoot. Most of them come back just fine, oblivious to the danger that this wilderness presents to anyone not adequately prepared. Some of them have to be brought out by search and rescue. Some of them just don't come back. A ranger or a random hiker might occasionally come across the deserted remains of a campsite and report it in. Those are the spooky ones, the ones where people just vanished and left behind a perfectly set up campsite. No explanation, no clues, just a deserted clearing, often with perfectly intact tents and personal effects. But there are bears and mountain lions, along with a handful of lesser predators that roam these forests, and sometimes they get hungry enough to stalk and even kill humans. And that doesn't even take into consideration the much more likely scenario, folks stepping out of their tents at night to take a piss and very quickly getting lost. Most humans aren't suited to survival in the wilderness, unfortunately. My radio squawked again. Tower 9, what's the word? Yeah, I see it, Billy. Looks to be a couple of miles due north of my tower. What's your plan? He asked. I knew what he meant. Keep an eye on it and hope for the best, or take a trip over and investigate. After a brief pause, I sighed with resignation. It's probably just a campfire, but I guess I better head over and take a look to be sure. I didn't relish the thought of trekking to that area of wilderness, to be honest. It was the only area I hadn't explored during my time here. There weren't many trails heading in that direction, and the ones that did were badly overgrown and too narrow for the Jeep. A couple of miles hike might not seem like a lot, but when you're out here alone, the dense trees seem to stretch on forever. 2 miles can feel like 100. Roger that, John, Billy replied. Take your pack and your rifle. Check in periodically. Will do. Tower 9 out, I said, replacing the binoculars on their hook and shouldering the red canvas backpack waiting dutifully in the corner chair. I grabbed the rifle from its rack over the doorframe, checked to make sure it was loaded, and headed out. As I locked the gate behind me, I threw my pack in the back of the Jeep and set the rifle beside it. The Jeep wouldn't get me too far before the brush made the trail impassable, but if it saved me even half a mile of hiking, it was well worth it. The sun was still high in the sky. I had plenty of time to get there and back before dusk, as long as I didn't dawdle. I started the engine and turned the wheels toward the unmaintained trail to my right. After only a few moments, the trees and canopy obscured any trace of the watchtower behind me. I was actually able to push the Jeep farther than expected, a pleasant surprise. I was probably a mile along the trail before it bent, and a massive pine lay across the path, much too large to go over. The dense underbrush around me ruled out the possibility of going around. I immediately lamented not bringing the chainsaw. Cutting it up and winching the pieces out of the way wouldn't have been too difficult and would have saved me a ton of trouble. With a quiet curse, I stepped out of the Jeep and grabbed my gear from the back seat. I smiled to myself as a quote from a certain fictional adventure-seeking archaeologist suddenly came to mind. "We walk from here." Making sure to mark the location of the Jeep on my handheld GPS, I stepped over the thigh-high tree trunk and continued along the path. According to my earlier estimate, the trail was heading in the direction of the smoke, which was a blessing in my book. The less time I had to spend bushwhacking, the better. The trail continued to narrow, as I expected, and before long, I was brushing branches and leaves with my shoulders as I walked. The trees, which had been alive with the cheering and chirping of animal life near the tower, now seemed muted. The forest around me was growing denser, feeling oddly claustrophobic at times. Billy checked in a few times, and I updated him on my progress, promising to maintain regular contact. He advised me that a weather relay from the ranger station had reported an approaching storm, likely to reach us before nightfall. A quick glance at my watch made me wince. I had already spent more time than I'd predicted. Maybe it was best to turn around and head back. The last thing I wanted was to get caught out here overnight with minimal supplies and a rainstorm. I wasn't worried, but it sure wouldn't be comfortable. If I'd been farther from my destination, I probably would have turned back right then. I wish I had. Within another 20 minutes, however, I smelled the faint scent of a wood fire. Not strong, but definitely there. I was even more certain of what I'd find when I reached them. When I stepped out of the now almost non-existent trail, I found myself in a sparsely treed area amidst a dozen or so wooden shacks, and I halted in surprise. I had reached the base of a hilly rise covered in heavy forest, and these old, forgotten cabins looked like they had belonged to some sort of small settlement. Perhaps an old logging camp, I thought. I didn't know this place even existed, and made a mental note to research it when I got back to my tower. I keyed the microphone. "Tower 12, this is John. Do you copy?" Billy replied, his voice staticky and distant. "Hey, John, Tower 12, what's your status?" I frowned and looked around at the towering trees all around me. I suppose I was asking more out of the portable radio than was reasonable. I was lucky I still had any signal at all. "I found what looks like an old logging or trapping camp," I said, meandering among the decaying and derelict cabins. Most had collapsed roofs and were barely standing. "The campfire has to be nearby. I'm going to take a look around a bit more." There was a pause before Billy spoke again. "What's your current location, John?" I glanced at my handheld GPS and relayed my position. Another pause. "John, I think you should probably just turn back. Come back, okay? You don't have many more hours of daylight left, and that storm looks like it's getting worse." Something in his voice sounded off, but I couldn't quite place it. Nervous, maybe? I couldn't blame him. My safety was his responsibility, and the idea of one of his lookouts being caught out in a storm overnight probably didn't sit well. Coincidentally, it didn't sit well with me either. "You may be right, Billy," I replied, turning around and casting my eyes over the area. "I'll just head." I stopped as my eyes caught sight of a bright yellow nylon tent just beyond the last of the structures. "Repeat your last, John." I didn't get that. "Stand by." "Tower 12, I said absently, making my way toward what I now realized was a small cluster of 3 modern tents situated around a central fire ring. The fire had been completely extinguished, but the embers still smoldered lowly, the source of the smoke. I looked around for the campers. Nothing. No one in sight or earshot. Sleeping bags and electric lanterns were still inside the tents, though I couldn't find any backpacks or supplies. "Hello?" I called out, turning in a circle. "I'm with the Forest Service. Is anyone here?" Nothing. Just the muted echo of my own voice. I was about to dump some dirt on the remaining embers of the campfire and call it a day when I noticed the narrow footpath leading toward the slope. In the soft dirt were clearly recent footprints heading away from the camp. I keyed the mic again. Tower 12, this is John. I found the source of the smoke. It's a campfire, all right? Nothing to be concerned about, Billy answered almost immediately. Roger that, John. Head back home. I paused a moment, curiosity pulling me toward the footpath. I'll be heading back shortly, Billy. Just want to check something out first. I wouldn't screw around out there, John, Billy replied, an edge to his voice. Better head back now so you can beat the storm. His last sentence didn't exactly sound like a suggestion. Something had him rattled. I hesitated before answering. Acknowledged, I said, knowing full well I was going to check out the path before heading back. Still, I didn't feel like arguing with my supervisor over something so small. Just a quick walk up that path, then I'd be on my way. This path was even less established than the one I'd been on earlier, but I could clearly see the campers' imprints in the dirt as I went. Before long, I emerged into a small clearing, eyes widening with yet another unexpected discovery. The rough-hewn timber that framed the entryway was set into the near vertical slope of the hillside before me. It created a dark tunnel entrance that had clearly been sealed off with a heavy iron gate many years ago, likely by the Park Service to keep inquisitive hikers from falling to their deaths in an old, abandoned mine shaft. So it had been a mining camp, not a logging one. I didn't know there were any mines near here. Hell, I wasn't even sure what they could have been mining for. Coal? Maybe gold? Did they even have gold mines in Tennessee? Who knows? Certainly not me. Clearly, regardless, now that gate stood wide on its hinges, the remains of a rusted chain and antique padlock lying in the dirt nearby. Hell, I couldn't just turn around and leave. One of these dumbass campers had decided it'd be fun to explore a closed and restricted mine entrance. This is Tower 12. This is John D. Reed. Billy probably wouldn't be happy that I'd continued my exploration after he told me to head back, but there was nothing to do about it now. I wasn't equipped or trained for any sort of cave exploration or rescue. The Rangers had very specialized teams for that sort of thing. But I could at least poke my head inside and see if there were any campers, or hear them, confirm if they went inside. No answer from the radio. I tried again, with the same results. I tried a different approach. Tower 15, this is John from Tower 12. Do you copy? I said into the radio. I figured I might be able to at least get Nathan's attention if I was out of range of Billy. Tower 12. There was a burst of static that sounded like it might have contained the hint of a human voice, but it was too distorted and distant to make anything out. There was only a moment of indecision before I made up my mind. I knew it was reckless going into the mine, especially when my supervisor believed I was currently on my way back to the tower. But I had this nagging intuition that something might be wrong with the whole situation. Maybe someone was hurt and needed help. I couldn't just leave them there, knowing that I might be their only chance of rescue. In retrospect, I should have turned back and called it in to the ranger station. They could have mobilized the search and rescue teams that specialized in cave rescues. I should have. But I didn't. I pulled my powerful LED flashlight from my pack, turned it on, and headed into the pitch-black darkness of the mine entrance. The walls and floor had been smoothly carved many years ago, which made my footing uneventful, and the tunnel itself was mostly a straight shot. Several times during the first few minutes, I turned back to watch the bright square of daylight at the entrance gradually shrink to a pinpoint of light. By the time I'd taken the first dogleg turn of the tunnel, I was in complete darkness. It was a very strange feeling, oppressive almost. At one point, I turned off my flashlight experimentally, but after only a few seconds, I quickly flicked it back on. In that short time, my heart had been pounding in my chest, and some primal fear had begun growing inside me. It took a moment to calm myself. The darkness was absolute. It was almost as if you could feel it pressing in on you. My footsteps seemed much louder than they should have on the dirt floor, and the air was growing cold and damp the further I went. After another 100 feet or so, the smoothly carved tunnel ended abruptly in a wall of rubble. I couldn't tell if it was a cave-in at some point, or if this was simply where the miners stopped digging and hadn't bothered to remove the debris. But either way, it certainly appeared to be the end of the line. And then I saw it. I almost missed it because of the way the light and shadows played over the head-sized rocks strewn before me. But when I looked closer, I realized I was looking at a ragged hole in the wall. It was only 5 feet across or so, and definitely didn't look like the deliberate formation of the tunnel I was standing in now. It almost looked like the miners had broken into a natural void of some sort. Interesting. But there was no way in hell I was going in there. I was definitely not trained or outfitted for any sort of spelunking trip, and it didn't seem the sort of thing suited to the learn-as-you-go method. Just as I was turning back to make my way out of the mine, I heard the distant sound of voices echoing from the opening in the stone wall. The sound was faint, and may have just been my imagination, but I didn't think so. "Hello?" I called, pressing my face into the black abyss of the hole. "Can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." Nothing. The air from beyond the breach was cold and smelled stale. Old. Wrong. It felt as if I didn't belong here. None of us did. There was a long moment of unbroken silence, and then I heard a voice again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that?" it said, presumably to a companion. It sounded like a young woman, nervous, uncertain. "Hello? Someone there?" That settled it for me. I carefully crawled through the opening into the space beyond. Shining my light around, I found myself in a small natural chamber, maybe 30 feet across, with an uneven ceiling of jagged rock that barely cleared my head. The first thing that caught my attention was the cracked lantern lying on the ground. It looked old. Very old. Maybe 100 years or more. A thick layer of grime and age covered its soot-blackened surface, and the glass was thick and uneven. Beside the askew lantern was a small leather-bound book, partially buried in the dirt and dust, with a moldering leather strap securing it closed. It looked like a journal. And without a thought, I tucked it into my backpack. Raising my light back up, scanning around the room. "Hello?" I called again. I didn't hear the voices anymore, but the narrow beam of my flashlight illuminated another tunnel in the far corner of this room, mired in darkness. "Can you hear me?" Once again, I got that feeling that something wasn't right. Then the voice came again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here?" she asked, her voice trembling with apprehension. I hesitated, frowning. Something didn't seem right about the voice, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Before I could summon my words to respond, another voice called out. This time, it was clear. The voice of a young man. "We can hear you moving around in there. Please help us. We're lost, and our friend is hurt." Hear me moving around in there? I was shouting to them. I sure as hell wasn't trying to hide. Could they not hear me for some reason? I stepped forward to the secondary tunnel and raised my voice again. "I'm with the Forest Service." It was then, when I reached out to steady myself against the wall of the tunnel entrance, that my hand met something wet, and I recoiled in disgust, thinking I had just grabbed a handful of some subterranean slime. When I shone my light on it, however, it became very clear the reality was far worse. Blood. I stepped back, trying to keep the panic that was fighting to take control of my rationality at bay. I needed to keep a level head, for now. Panning my light around, I saw an astonishing amount of blood painting the wall and floor in front of me. Somebody had definitely been hurt, and badly. With blood loss like this, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stabilize them long enough to get rescue in here. What the hell happened here? And why did the hikers continue into the cave after one of them was injured this badly? Unless they lost their light and got turned around, there was no way for them to get lost. There hadn't been any branches to this tunnel since I first entered. All they had to do was turn around and walk until they saw daylight. The man's voice called again, colored with the unmistakable tinge of fear. "What the hell is that? Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand." He seemed to be getting closer. At least if I could guide them to my voice, maybe I could get them out of here. Get to higher ground. Radio for rescue evac. They had a helicopter permanently stationed at the main ranger station. It could be here in 20 minutes if I was able to reach them. The woman's voice came again, and this time I froze. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? All at once, it hit me. The indescribable unease I had been mostly successful in repressing now fought back with renewed vigor. I realized in that moment what I had missed previously. The woman had repeated herself, twice now. No change in her inflection, no variation in emotion or urgency. It was exactly the same, down to the syllable. It was like I was listening to a recording. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? Repeated the male voice, now even closer. Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand. Below the words, I could hear the stealthy sliding of something over rocks. It seemed like it wasn't too far beyond the tunnel entrance now, but I wasn't going to wait for it to emerge from the darkness. I didn't think that what I'd see emerge from the darkness would be a couple of college kids who'd had a rough time of it during a weekend camping trip. Allowing my panic to run free, I turned and threw myself through the cave breach and landed roughly on the flat stone floor of the mine shaft. Beyond skinning my hands to hell and banging my knee on a rock, scrambling my feet with a hiss of pain, I ran as fast as I could, not realizing until I finally burst into the waning light of the late afternoon that I had lost my rifle somewhere in that cave. It was darker than it was when I first entered the mine, and a quick glance to the sky showed the angry black thunderheads that had moved in, as promised, much faster than I had expected. I quickly swung the iron gate closed on screeching hinges and looped the chain between the bars as tightly as I could, securing it rather lamely with the hasp of a broken padlock. I stood there for a long moment, bent over with my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath outside the mine entrance when I felt the first drops of the coming storm on the back of my neck. I straightened and looked through the bars of the gate into the ominous darkness beyond, realizing how ridiculous my barricade really was. It wouldn't do much good if something tried to get out, but at least it made me feel a little bit better. At least it made me feel a little bit better until I heard the voice echoing from the mine shaft. Peh, getting closer. It was unmistakable. Uncanny. Hello, can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you. By the time dawn arrived the next morning, I had climbed down from my temporary shelter in the low boughs of the red cedar and tried to work out all the painful kinks from my stiff shoulders and neck. The night had not been kind to me, but I was alive, which is more than my fiercest mind expected after yesterday. The night had been harrowing. There was no better word to describe it. The rain hissed among the trees and stung exposed skin angrily, driven by the banshee wail of the wind rushing through the forest, accentuated by the chaotic flashing of lightning and the heart-stopping crack of thunder. Because of this relentless chaos, it's difficult to say with any certainty. But throughout the night, I thought I heard something large trying to move stealthily in the forest near my shelter. I say, trying, because it felt like whatever stalked through the underbrush was more at home in the unnatural, Stygian gloom of a cave than under the watchful eyes of nature. Of course, it could just as easily have been my imagination. In the first dim light of dawn, as it started to illuminate the sodden and dripping forest, I spent the better part of 20 minutes straining my eyes with every ounce of concentration as I scanned the gray woodlands around me. I was only 10 feet or so above the ground, but there was no way I was going to step foot from my hide until I was absolutely certain that I was alone. Once I was satisfied, I was alone for the moment. I climbed down to the muddy ground. I tried the radio several times through the night and into the morning, but wasn't able to get even a burst of static that might indicate someone trying to respond. A combination of the storm and interference from the trees worked against me. My first thought was to get back to my Jeep as quickly as possible and run every drop of gas out of its tank, trying to get as far away from this place as I could. When I checked the GPS to see how close I was to its marked position, however, I found the unit unresponsive, with a disastrous crack across the screen that seemed to mock my dismay, probably caused by my less than graceful scramble from that damned cave. A rifle? No radio? No GPS. Perfect. I still had a compass and the rising sun to guide me, though, and that was something. I was only a couple miles from my tower, which should have been somewhere due south of where I stood. I knew that once I got close, I should be able to either find the service road or the tower itself, so there wasn't much danger of getting myself lost, at least. It was a small comfort, but one I gladly took. I moved through the trees and undergrowth with more speed and recklessness than I probably should have. An ankle broken by an errant misstep would have been bad news. Still, even though I hadn't heard or seen anything of my late-night visitor, I couldn't help but feel I was being watched. Do you know that creeping sense of dread you feel when you've just turned off the lights in the basement and now have to climb the stairs back to the light of the doorway? Or when you're making your way from your car in a dark and lonely parking lot? The feeling that something is there, something much more suited to the dark than you are? It's that same feeling that pushed my footsteps almost to a jog as I traversed the uneven ground and storm-felled trees that tried to hinder my passage. For the next hour, I moved at this pace, aware of every rasping lungful of breath, knowing that I should pause and rest for a few minutes, as pushing myself to fatigue would only increase my chances of falling or hurting myself. I imagined myself lying in blinding pain next to an unseen chuck hole, clutching at a broken leg and watching as the sunlight began to dim with the onset of dusk, waiting for whatever hunted my trail to find me. What would happen? Would I even have time to look on its visage before it struck? Did those campers in the cave? A misstep and a stumble that nearly made this nightmare a self-fulfilled prophecy jarred me back to the present. Against all instinct, I forced my pace to slow, first to a trot, then to a walk, and then reluctantly, I stopped completely, trying to catch my breath while I scanned the dense woodland around me. Nothing. No. Not nothing. As my heart began to slow and my breathing returned to a more manageable cadence, I turned my gaze back in the direction I had been headed, and an unconscious smile found its way to my lips. The sun had risen high in the morning sky during my flight, and now I caught a flash of its reflection on the windows of my tower, not 200 yards directly ahead of me. I laughed aloud with relief, fully aware that this fear-tinted eruption was closer to the manic cackle of lunacy than anything else. I didn't care, though. My feet started forward on their own, quickly reaching a brisk pace. A few minutes later, I burst out of the trees into the maintained clearing surrounding my tower, feeling the full sunlight on my face for the first time since yesterday. Had it only been a day? It seemed like longer. I was so filled with relief that I didn't even register the fact that the forestry department Jeep sat parked near my fenced-in tower until I started entering the combination into the gate lock. The faded white 12 emblazoned on the corner of the windshield told me that it was Billy's Jeep, which wasn't much of a surprise. I realized after a moment, after not hearing back from him, that I was more surprised I hadn't returned to find an entire search and rescue team making preparations to search for their lost puppy. I punched the 4-digit code into the mechanical combination lock on the gate and stepped through, making sure to close and lock it behind me. I stood there for a moment, staring through the tall chain-link fence at the dense tree line, wondering if something waited just out of sight in the shadows, staring back at me with hungry anticipation. I shook off the sudden chill as best as I could and made my way quickly to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Billy was going to be pissed at me, I was sure, but that thought was a fleeting one that didn't take purchase. His displeasure was the least of my concerns right now. When I reached the top, I threw open the trapdoor and suddenly found myself looking down the muzzle of a very large rifle. Even in that brief moment of abrupt shock, I could register how the barrel trembled in the hands of its agitated master, and I wondered how close I came to having my life ended in a brief flash of light. The moment only lasted a second or two, and then Billy hastily swung the rifle away in a safe direction. "Damn it, John," he exclaimed, his tone an incongruous mixture of relief and fear. "I almost shot you." I stepped fully through the trap door and let it close behind me. "Jesus, Billy," I breathed, leaning back against the railing. I suddenly felt weary and realized it was likely the adrenaline now rushing through my system that had kept me moving at such a hurried pace throughout the morning. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, stepping back inside my shack and taking a chair at the small table in the center of the room. I noted with mild interest that he kept the rifle leaning against the table beside him instead of stowing it in the rack over the door, but decided not to comment on it. Billy Johnson was in his middle years, maybe 45 or so, with a bit of a gut and grayish-brown hair, trimmed clothes. He wore an impressive mustache that reminded me of something an Old West gunslinger might sport. He was dressed in typical attire, khaki Forest Service shirt and brown cargo pants. In addition to the rifle, I had had the unfortunate opportunity to closely examine a moment earlier. I noticed that he wore his .500 Magnum in a holster at his side. That wasn't too unusual. When in the bush, bears and mountain lions can sneak up on you unawares. Having a hand cannon within easy reach goes a long way toward taking the fight out of them if necessary. It was a little unusual for a drive over to another tower, I suppose, but not exceptionally so, given the circumstances. I took the opposite chair, dropping my pack to the floor next to me. I realized my legs were still shaking anxiously and placed my hands on my knees to try to calm them. He was trying to deflect, but he was horrendously bad at it. He knew something. I was sure of it. "You know where I've been," I replied, gambling on instinct. I watched his face closely for a reaction and wasn't disappointed when he winced and turned his focus out the window and over the forest to the north. "I told you to abort and head back to your tower," he stated brusquely. "But you just had to feed that curiosity of yours, didn't you? You're damn lucky to be alive, you know that?" From my chair, I reached under the cupboard to my right and pulled a half-empty bottle of Jameson and a couple of mostly clean glasses. Billy turned his head and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Alcohol was a no-no up here, but when I poured and handed him one of the glasses, he accepted it without a word. I took a pull from the other. "It's my own damn fault, I suppose," he continued, turning back fully to me. "It's been so long since anyone's even thought of Camp LeClaire that it didn't even click for me when you told me where you saw the campfire." I took another drink and then poured a bit more of the whiskey. "Camp LeClaire," I repeated. "That old mining camp?" "Logging camp, actually," he corrected me. "The mine was there long before the East Atlantic Logging Company set up out there. Nobody knows who dug it. Hell, nobody even knows when it was dug, a long time before the 19th century at least. Camp LeClaire was established in 1872, and the mine was old even before that." He looked at me in earnest for the first time since I'd returned and frowned. "You look like hell, John. Got caught in the storm, I'm guessing." "Hell of a storm." I only raised my eyebrows as if to say, "What an understatement." Billy nodded knowingly and took another swallow. "Did you find the campers at least?" I shook my head and turned to look out the window to the north, where I could almost envision the black void of that mine entrance staring back at me. "No," I said softly. "I tracked them to the mine but lost them in the cave." I jumped when Billy's glass hit the floor, and he was out of his chair before I even realized it. Billy hadn't moved from his seat, but now both hands were splayed on the table before him as if to steady himself. His pale blue eyes were wide and fixed on me. "You went into the cave?" he said, a sudden and horrifying realization dawning on him. It was then I realized my mistake. He hadn't known. He thought I had just discovered the camp and the mine, and then got caught in the storm overnight. A close call, but nothing that couldn't be undone. "Yeah," I replied, nodding slowly, deliberately. "Yeah, I went into that cave looking for the campers. The gate had been cracked open already. I'm not sure by whom or when." I leaned forward in my chair and stared hard at him. "Billy, there's something in there. I think it got those campers." I think it followed me out. Billy Johnson's face had gone white then, and I thought for a moment he might pass out. He scooped his glass up from the floor with numb fingers and poured himself another splash of whiskey, downing it in one gulp. When he spoke again, it sounded far away and distant. "Utami," he muttered. "That's what the Chickasaw called it, and they were here long before we ever were. Blur is what the white man called it, among other names, Kuatami." He nodded. "False brother, lying man, something like that. Hell, I don't know. What do I look like, a translator?" "It means bad," he continued. "No matter what language you speak, it means something's out there that isn't supposed to be, something that was locked away a long time ago and forgotten." It was then that he stood and grabbed his rifle, as if suddenly remembering something. "I need to get back to my tower and make a call now." I gestured to the radio base station sitting patiently on the table near the door. "Why not use mine?" Billy shook his head. "Sorry, John. It doesn't work that way. Special phone, special number. I just hope I'm not too late." I started to stand. "I'll go with you," I said. He pointed a stern finger at me and narrowed his eyes. "No, you stay here, strap on your handgun, and make sure it's loaded." His voice was calm, almost cold, and didn't leave much room for debate. Still, I had no desire to stay alone with whatever this angler thing was roaming around out here. "Billy, I can go with you. I can help." I started to argue, but it was quickly cut off when he took a menacing step toward me. And I realized quickly how much I'd underestimated him because of his normally easy manner. "You will stay in your goddamn tower, and you will follow orders," he roared. I took an unconscious step back and reclaimed my seat, only managing a shaking nod in agreement. He took a trembling breath, pointed at the radio, and said in a slightly less terrifying tone, "And keep that thing on. As soon as I'm back at my tower, I'll radio you with updates." A moment later, he was gone, and the trapdoor slammed shut behind him. I stood and retrieved the Pelican case from under my cot. Inside was the same model of .500 Magnum revolver that Billy had been wearing, heavy and cold in my hands. I loaded it and belted it on the leather holster, feeling the reassuring weight tugging at my waist. "John?" I heard Billy call from below. I went outside to the walkway, leaning over the railing. He was standing beside his Jeep, 50 feet below, shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight as he looked up at me. "Make sure to keep everything locked. I'll come back for you," he shouted. I raised a hand to him and slid the latch shut on the trapdoor with my toe. I turned back into my shack as I heard Billy's Jeep fire up, and a moment later, it drove off down the rough service road toward his tower. I glanced back to the north, to the place where I had first seen the campfire smoke rising the day before, and suppressed a shudder. I was alone again, safe in my tower and armed, but alone. Abruptly, like an unexpected wave of nausea, the feeling that I was being watched washed over me with a chill, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked back over my shoulder to where Billy had been only a minute before, but saw only the rough service road and dense, impenetrable tree line beyond. That's probably just my imagination, but the feeling didn't diminish, and with every passing breath, I was more and more certain that there was something nearby, just out of sight, standing stone still in the gray-green foliage, waiting. I stood there a long moment, eyes straining for any hint of movement or alien shape among the shadows. But if there was, my human eyes weren't sharp enough to pick it out. I stepped back through the open doorway of my shack and dropped down into the chair again, my eyes catching the bottle of whiskey before me. I was tempted to pour another drink to help settle my nerves, but I could already feel the tickle of a buzz at the edges of my mind from what I'd already drunk, and quickly decided that was the last thing I needed for my reflexes and awareness to be dulled right now. I'd made more than one poor decision in the last 24 hours, and I didn't think adding another to the pile was such a great idea. Grabbing the bottle, I screwed the cap back on and reached to return it to the sparse cover to my right. As I did so, my boot caught my pack, knocking it over. Without a thought, I reached down to move it out of the way, and then remembered the old weather journal tucked inside the front pocket. The one I'd found in the cave. I reached into the unzipped front pocket. For a frustratingly alarming moment, my searching hand couldn't feel anything in the compartment, and I feared that I'd lost it in my chaotic escape. But then my fingers brushed the familiar shape, and I withdrew it, setting it in front of me on the table. I could see the book much more clearly now in the daylight. It wasn't overly large. A little larger than my hand, and maybe the thickness of my thumb. There were no markings on the front except for a simple, grimy brass loop that secured the leather strap holding it closed. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was inside, but I needed some answers. Anything. A stray sound from the trees below rose to my ears, and I froze, listening intently for more, but none came. The forest around me was silent again, and I turned my attention back to the journal, pulling the strap free from the cover and turning to the front page. From the pocket of Andrew Robinson, it said. The writing was neat and compact and distinctly male. The ink was a rich black, scrawled upon brittle yellow pages, and though faded with the years, was still mostly legible. I turned to the next page, where the entries began. I felt as though I had dropped into his account midway, as though this was just the latest in a series of journals that Andrew Robinson had been keeping. 23rd July, 1891. After nearly a week of hard overland trekking, we reached the abandoned camp late this afternoon, exactly where the old trapper said we would. Sequoia Arpani, tracker, has once again astonished me with his overland navigation skills. I must admit I was skeptical at the yar in the old tavern, spun the crowded confines of the common house in Dun Creek, especially after I smelled the liquor on his breath. But the professor never gathered a moment. The man's instincts for reading human character are absolutely singular. The camp looks to have been abandoned, and I have to admit a certain unease as we inspected the rough cabins. There isn't a soul to be found, and it looks years abandoned, yet everything stands as if awaiting the loggers' return at any moment. Strange. 24th July, 1891. Our small troop, both intrepid adventurers, made camp in the center of LeClaire last night. Those cabins likely would have been more comfortable, but I doubt any of us would have felt at ease intruding upon them. Richards laughed it off when someone mentioned how peculiar it was that the loggers had departed in such a hurry that they abandoned their personal possessions. But I could see in his eyes that he felt it odd as well. Sequoia, our ever-courageous and solid guide, seemed ill at ease and unusually withdrawn, refusing all conversation and only responding in queries with quiet grunts. Something of concern hides behind his eyes, though, and I wonder what it is. Only the professor seems unmoved by the unusually still atmosphere of this place, and his typical infectious positivity keeps working at our unease, keeping it from expanding beyond its current state. Today, we spent much of the day exploring the area surrounding Camp LeClaire, and the sunlight was nearly spent when Dobson burst back into camp with news of his discovery. We all of us raced at a moment's notice behind him as he led us along an ill-used and nearly invisible footpath that led ever ascending upon the side of the northern rocky slope. When the path terminated, we were deposited before a truly curious sight, a barricaded tunnel entrance that had been bored into the rock face by some unknown hands. I suspect some sort of exploration tunnel or added dug-in search of precious ores, especially given the nation's more recent history with gold fever. The wooden barrier that had been roughly assembled from a hodgepodge of heavy timber beams was curious, and several of our group commented on it. But the professor dismissed the triviality, so the matter was dropped. It is far too late in the day to proceed any further, but we plan to penetrate the barricade and enter the tunnel in the morning. The excitement among the men is palpable. 25th July 1891. Sequoia is gone. He took his supplies and his prized Winchester rifle and fled sometime during the night like a phantom. This is a shocking blow to all of us, foreign to the professor, with whom the Pawnee tracker had partnered for a number of years across much of the eastern states. We have no explanation for his sudden desertion, and it sits unwell with the entirety of the group. The overall mood has darkened, I fear. Still, we must push onward. 25th July 1891 addendum. It took more than 2 hours of hard labor, but we were finally able to gain entrance to the mine shortly before noon today. Richards managed to get his boot caught between two heavy timbers as he stumbled forward, straining his ankle with a terrible cry. We feared it broken, but Dr. Franklin assured us that his bones seemed intact. Regardless, Richards was taken back to the camp, where he will convalesce while the rest of us make our entry. His part in our exploration has come to an end for now. We made our way in a single file through the added tunnel, for some way before reaching its carved end. The light from our oil lanterns providing regrettably inadequate illumination over the rocky surroundings. When we reached the terminus of the mine tunnel, our hearts sank for a moment before the professor gave an exclamation of discovery and suddenly disappeared through a nearly hidden rift in the wall, surrounded by jagged rocks. We eagerly followed him through, careful of our footing as we went, and found ourselves in what I can only assume to be an accidental breach by the miners into a natural cave system. The air was chill and unmoving, but our excitement over this discovery laid any concerns or discomfort this may have caused. The professor directed us to set up a secondary camp in this new chamber, which we'll use as a staging point for further exploration. So, we spent the rest of the day bringing supplies for our main camp and constructing a smaller version in this moderately sized chamber. By the time we completed this endeavor, the efforts of the day precluded the start of the exploration until the group has had the opportunity to rest and replenish their energy. I feel I will sleep well tonight despite the anxious excitement buzzing around my mind. 26th July, 1891. Another shock. When we woke this morning, O'Connor is gone. The Irishman, who has ever been reliable and constant as the North Star, was assigned first watch last night. There is no trace of him, and no indication that he took any provisions or even his personal rucksack with him. I fear his natural inquisitiveness may have gotten the best of him and led him to explore the deeper caverns beyond our ad hoc base camp, for his lantern is the sole item that has gone missing with his person. The professor immediately rallied the rest of our small group, 7 in all now, and mounted a search for our lost companion. I tried to caution him against rushing into action, but he was not to be deterred. To my dismay, I was the sole man ordered to remain here at camp, whilst my companions took up their supplies and launched deeper into the cave system in the event young O'Connor returned in their absence. I was understandably disappointed, but grasped the logic of it well enough. I would loathe to think of O'Connor returning only to find us all gone, and then losing himself again, trying to find us. I shall endeavor to rest a bit. With luck, my companions will return before long with our lost compatriot. 27th July 1891. I am at my wit's end, and I'm unsure how to proceed. It has been more than a day since the professor led the rest of the men in search of poor O'Connor, and I have felt their absence as keenly as I am aware of my own solitude in this cave. I've seen nothing of our missing companion or the party that delved deeper into the system yesterday morning, and I know their lanterns did not have sufficient fuel to carry them for this long without other means of illumination to guide their return. I fear they are hopelessly lost. I myself had to return to Leclerc for more lantern oil for my waning light. I must admit, with no little embarrassment and some reluctance, to my return to this dark place, which no longer carries any of its former adventurous excitement or fascination. It is now nothing more than a doorway into the deep places below the earth, where men were never intended to tread. But the growing apprehension is not the worst of it. The sounds, by heaven's grace, the sounds. I first became aware of them last night as I did my lantern and tried to set myself to sleep. At first, it was only an indistinct and muted echo, which may have been interpreted as nothing more than the distant whistle of wind or other natural sound distorted by the unique acoustics of this place. Then I heard the distinct tonal qualities that could only be a man's voice. I instantly rose and took my lantern, raising the flame and rushing to the entrance of the cave that swallowed my companions. There I stood, listening with such keen focus that I felt beads of sweat upon my brow. I would swear upon a holy book that it was the distant call of the professor himself, and I eagerly called back with as much fervor as I could summon, hoping desperately to guide them back to me. However, the instant I called out, the voices vanished, and I was met only with the suffocating silence of an open tomb. There I stood, straight as a sentinel, praying for a response from my friends. After several minutes of absolute silence, my thoughts began turning to dark things. I became painfully aware that anything beyond the weak cast of my lantern would be utterly invisible to me. But I, on the other hand, would be lighted as a beacon to it. I pushed these thoughts from my mind as forcefully as I could, inwardly chastising myself for seeing ghouls where none existed. I was about to call out again to my lost companions when I heard it. The voice came again, echoing from the claustrophobic abyss that lay before me, mired in the blackest darkness one could imagine. It was still some distance away, I estimated, but I was certain it seemed closer now. When the third time I heard it, I was just barely able to make out the words, but it was enough to be sure. My own words echoed back at me from the depths of that damned cave, and in my own voice, I staggered and nearly dropped the lantern. At that moment, could the legends be true? The professor always seemed to believe them, though I must admit I attributed his faith to the unwavering certainty he held in those things lost to antiquity. He'd always maintained that a legend, especially one whispered by so many indigenous people without mutual contact, must have some root in truth. But that line of reasoning is antithetical to modern civility, and I must reject it and focus on the more probable explanation that my already stressed nerves were turning my fears against me. The voices must be those of my companions, lost in the dark, but near enough to hear their calls. They must be. I'm not certain what lies next, but I know that I cannot abandon my companions, my friends, to wander the darkness until they fall from exhaustion or dehydration. Not while I might yet help them. I will leave this written account at the entrance to the cave. This lantern is nearly spent, but I have another with a full vessel that'll take its stead. If I do not return, at least someone may know of our passing here. May God be with us all. I closed the journal with a trembling hand, momentarily lost in what I just read. How is it possible? The journal was more than 130 years old. No animal alive then could be what pursued me now. What if it's not an animal? The sudden burst of static from Billy's call that simultaneously erupted from my radio base station and the portable handset clipped to my shoulder made me jump and drop the journal to the floor, heart pounding. I cursed under my breath and keyed the microphone. "Go for Tower 9, I answered, my voice tight as I spoke. My eyes drifted out across the sky to the east, where darkening thunderheads had been unknowingly gathering and marching slowly in my direction. I shook my head. Icing on the cake, I thought. "John, what's your position?" asked Billy, the self-assured authority that filled his tone now strangely absent, replaced with something else, fear. I frowned a moment at the question before answering. "What do you think, Billy? I'm in my tower, just like you told me." A strange pause before he spoke again. "John, this isn't some sort of joke, right? You're not outside my tower?" I was growing more agitated by the moment. What sort of question was that? I had no jeep. There was no way I could have made it to his tower in such a short amount of time, even if I'd wanted to. "No, Billy," I answered with more force than I intended. "I'm not outside your tower." I stopped mid-sentence, a horrified realization sweeping over me. In that moment, I tried to speak, but my mouth had gone dry. "Billy," it was all I could muster. The radio was silent as my eyes slowly drifted to the west, where I could just make out the small, lonely shape of Tower 12. Barely visible over the darkening blanket of green, was that a gunshot? Another night, another goddamn night stuck in this window-lined prism. At least I have a good view, so I guess that's something. The storm raged all night again last night, and only let up just before dawn. At one point, the winds were gusting hard enough to rock the tower, which was a bit disconcerting, to say the least. As I stand out on the wet catwalk around my shack, I see that the clouds haven't let us go just yet, and look every bit as pissed off as they did yesterday afternoon. It seems like the last dry season has come to an end, which is good since I've been slacking a bit on my fire watching duties over the last couple of days. Gallows humor, right? Due to that, or I'm sitting in the corner in a fetal position crying. I've been told by my ex-fiancée that I'm not an attractive crier. I haven't heard Pete from Billy since his last terrifying broadcast to me yesterday. I tried to reach him several times since then, but no dice. I've also tried reaching Nathan and the ranger station, but all I get is static, even from my base radio set. When I first started here, I remember Billy telling me during my brief orientation that the radio should be able to reach out 50 miles or more, so I'm not sure what's going on with them. Update. I just took a quick look at the base station and found that the cable leading up to the antenna on the roof of the shack is now just a dangly thing swaying in the breeze. The storm must have decided it needed the antenna more than I did because it's gone. I can see where the screws were torn out of the wooden mast, and before you say anything about whatever this thing is that's been stalking around and deciding to sabotage my radio, I should probably tell you that the wooden antenna mast looks like it's been around for a long time. The wood was probably dry rotted to begin with, and now that it's soaked, it's crumbled away into little wet brown bits as soon as I probed it with my fingers. Speaking of whatever this Kwatami or angler thing is, and I'm just going to call it a mimic, I think I haven't heard anything weird since yesterday. I'm assuming it's still over there somewhere, but I don't think it's nearby. If it's still anywhere around here, it's probably somewhere over near Tower 12, or at least that's what makes the most sense to me anyways. Which brings me to my shiny new lunatic idea. My Jeep. It can't be more than a mile down the northern track, still sitting there in front of that fallen pine. I could probably get to it in less than an hour, even with this wet and muddy ground. It had almost a full tank of gas, and I'm pretty sure I could outrun this mimic thing in it if I could get a straight shot down the service road. I definitely don't relish the idea, mind you. Every instinct is screaming at me to sit my butt right down where I am in this tower, and I know the ranger station will start getting a little antsy when Billy doesn't check in after a few days, but I'm also thinking they may extend it out a day or two in light of the foul weather. Maybe 5 days out in the wilderness, and then I'll have a ranger truck parked outside my tower. The question is, what they'll find when they get here. See, I've been thinking about it. Billy definitely knew more about this thing than I do. Certainly enough to not open the door when he heard it outside, pretending to be a Girl Scout selling cookies. That makes me think that maybe the fence and the trapdoor might not be enough to stop it if it really wants in. As pants shittingly terrified as the prospect of leaving the tower and making for the Jeep is, sitting here cornered in my window-lined shack, just waiting for it to show up in the middle of the night, is worse. At least I have a chance out there. I still have the Magnum. It's been holstered to my belt since yesterday. They don't issue pea shooters for bear protection out here. This thing is the most powerful handgun in mass production. It'll put down anything in North America as long as you can hit it right. Any normal animal, anyways. Who knows what this thing is capable of? Still, it does provide a level of comfort and gives me some confidence that my plan may work. It's on my side for now. I'm going to try to eat a granola bar to put something in my churning stomach and try to build a little energy. I don't think I've eaten anything since yesterday. After that, I'm grabbing my pack and heading out. Wish me luck. I left my tower shortly after 10 a.m., and let me tell you, those were some of the most difficult first steps I've ever taken in my life. Stepping out through the chain link fence into that open space beyond my small compound felt like I was stepping off the roof of a skyscraper. When I closed the gate behind me, I stood there motionless. Must have been 5 minutes, frozen in place with my hand clenching the grip of my revolver that's holstered at my belt. Even with all the stress and anxiety swirling around in my head, I was amazed at how keen my senses seemed in that moment. I felt like I could hear every rustle of leaves and smell every damp patch of moss in the thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding me. In that moment, I felt very small, very insignificant, trivial. When my chest began to ache, I realized that I'd been holding my breath in subconsciously, afraid to make even the smallest sound. I let out a slow breath and forced myself to breathe normally again, scanning the trees. I turned slowly in a circle, eyes searching for anything that seemed out of place, like it didn't belong. But there was nothing there. Everything seemed normal, at least to me. Casting one last look over my shoulder at the refuge of my tower, I started off along the seldom used service road to the north, careful of my footing on the muddy and uneven ground. I allowed myself to move at a slow jog, fast enough to make good progress, but not so fast that I was announcing my presence to the world. Not so fast that I couldn't hear the forest around me over my own breathing. I stopped a couple of times during my trek to catch my breath and take a drink of water, and thankfully still seemed alone and unpursued for now. I wondered if it was out there somewhere among the dense trees, hiding in the muted gray shadows of the forest. Or perhaps it had returned to my tower in my absence and found it empty, and was even now tracking my flight along this trail. If I paused long enough, would it suddenly appear, rounding the gentle curve behind me as it caught up to me, in order to prefer to move more stealthily among the trees and underbrush, laying in wait alongside the path ahead, ready for my approach? I had to forcibly shake myself of that line of thought. It wasn't doing me any good now. I was committed to my plan. The thought of retracing my steps and returning to my lonely watchtower held just as much terror, because now it's out there, unmanned, unwatched, and abandoned. For all I know, the mimic could be there at this very moment, ransacking my shack. I definitely didn't want to walk in on that little scene. I can promise you that much. I ended up making surprisingly good time on that northern path. It was only about 30 minutes before I saw the dim shape of my Jeep waiting dutifully in the middle of the path ahead. The matte tan paint job and black cloth roof stood out remarkably well against the muted greens and browns of the surrounding forest. Urging my pace to quicken, I covered the last 100 yards before I even realized it and found myself standing at the door, hand on the handle. I paused. A chill ran down my spine, inciting an unbidden shiver, and I realized then how quiet the forest around me was. I wasn't sure how long it had been this way. I felt that something was out of place, and so did the native fauna. On any given day, the trees were alive with the sounds of wildlife. Squirrels and chipmunks chittered, insects buzzed, and 1,000 varieties of birds called and sang from the treetops. Not now, though. Now it was as if they had all left. It felt very alone in that moment, only not quite alone. Somewhere out there, in that sea of trees, something stalked, something that didn't belong in the light of day, something that didn't belong under the watchful eyes of Mother Nature. I was pretty sure she wouldn't have let something like the mimic evolve had it not been hidden in its underground realm. The door of the Jeep was thankfully quiet as I depressed the latch and swung it open. If this had been a horror movie, I'm sure an ear-splitting screech would have erupted from its hinges. But in real life, we tend to take care of these vehicles pretty well. In the best of times, they are the only convenient transportation for 20 miles or more. In times like this, though, it was likely the only thing that would save my sorry ass. I jumped in and pulled the door shut behind me with a dull thunk, subconsciously locking it. I almost laughed when I did that. The entire top of the Jeep was nothing more than canvas and plastic windows. A feisty hamster could probably have penetrated my little haven, and I doubt the mimic would even think twice about it. The Jeep fired up immediately when I turned the key in the ignition, and I threw it in reverse for the most ungraceful 14-point turn you've ever seen on the narrow and muddy service road. Once I got it turned around, I didn't waste any time directing it the way I'd come. The service road was really little more than an uneven and ill-maintained dirt trail, and was only ever used infrequently by the rangers and lookouts. As I'd previously mentioned, it was a rough ride, even for the heavy suspension of my trusty steed, so I had to keep it at a reasonable speed. The very last thing I needed was to snap an axle or bounce myself right off the road and into the trees. Considering the condition of the trail, with the fact that it constantly wound and curved as it progressed, it meant that even my best speed wasn't much faster than I could run on foot. That's okay. Once I got past my tower, the service road was generally better maintained and followed a more or less straight path. I'd be able to build some decent speed there and be out of the wilderness and standing at the ranger station in an hour or so. The abrupt appearance of my tower caused me to feather off the gas as I rounded the last curve from the northern track. I slowed to a crawl and squinted through the now dirty windshield. From here, everything looked exactly like I had left it. The gate still stood closed, and looking up, I could see the trapdoor also appeared shut. Maybe this thing hadn't returned. Hell, maybe this thing wasn't ever going to return. For all I knew, I was headed in the opposite direction. It's not like looking at a GPS on it or anything. It was at that moment that I nearly pissed myself when the radio, still clipped to my belt, squawked, and I heard probably the last thing I had ever expected to hear. "John, are you there?" The signal was pretty clear, but his voice sounded weak, strained. I almost didn't respond. I was frozen in indecision, clouding my mind. I didn't know what I could trust to be true, but I doubted that this mimic had read the radio manual and learned how to operate the handset. I snatched the handset from my shoulder and keyed the mic. "Billy? Holy? Is that you?" He answered me right away, and I thought I could hear relief in his tone, buried under his pained words. "John? Thank God. I was afraid you were gone." My eyes drifted to the trail leading past my tower toward the ranger station, toward safety. Another 5 minutes, and I would have been there. I got to my Jeep, and I was just about to haul ass for the ranger station when I replied, "What's your status?" There was a moment of silence, and I wondered briefly if he hadn't even heard me. But then he answered, "I'm not doing too hot, John. I'm in my tower, but that thing hurt me. I've lost a lot of blood, and I've been drifting in and out. I've patched myself up as best as I could. I stopped the bleeding for my leg." He frowned and closed his eyes for a moment, asking a question I was pretty sure I knew the answer to. "Are you able to get back to your Jeep?" I thought I heard a coughing bark of laughter before he answered. "I don't think so. Pretty banged up, man. What happened?" "Billy, son of a... It got into my tower, managed to get a shot off, but not before it got a jump on me. I took off before it did me in, so I think I hit it. I don't know where it is now, though. My tower is wide open, and it hasn't come back, so maybe it's dead." I doubted that. Things never work out that simply. "Are you stable, Billy? Can you be moved?" Another silence, and then he said, "I know what you're thinking, John. Just turn your Jeep around and haul ass to the ranger station. That's an order." I dropped my forehead to the steering wheel, closing my eyes and cursing. It would have been easier if Billy hadn't radioed me. I know it's selfish. I know I'm an idiot for even thinking it, but I could have been blissfully out of range if he'd only waited for 10 more minutes. Still, I put the throttle down and got the hell out of there. I could still race for the ranger station, have them mobilize a chopper to come back for Billy. But they were at least an hour away. Factor in the spin-up time for the helicopter, and you're talking more like an hour and a half before anyone gets to him. It didn't sound good. Something told me it was unlikely he'd last that amount of time. I could still turn left. I'd likely live. But could I live with myself knowing that I left Billy to die alone in his tower? What if our situations had been reversed? Sure, I might be saying the same words he was saying now, but in my heart, I'd be pleading for that voice on the radio to help me. I couldn't imagine being in his position, lying there, hurt, bleeding out, knowing that his safe haven was wide open and that thing was out there somewhere. Look, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're probably saying already. Don't be a dumbass. This is exactly why everyone dies in a horror movie. I get it, believe me. I get it. But this wasn't a movie. My friend was lying there, dying in his shack. If I could get to him and get him into the Jeep, we could both get out of there, leaving this twisted nightmare behind us. Billy, I'm headed your way. Get ready, because we're going to wrestle you down the stairs and into my Jeep as quickly as we can, I said, cranking the wheel to the right and taking the western trail with more speed than I should have. John, I gave you an order. Get out of here now. Despite the situation, I managed to start a grin as my rig bucked and bounced over the uneven trail. Billy, I'd like to take this opportunity to officially tender my resignation from the fire watch. Now shut your mouth and conserve your strength. I'll be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Trying to be a pretty good guess, and before long, I skidded to a halt outside Tower 12, next to Billy's ride. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet air, my handgun coming from its holster and held before me like some sort of shield. I took a quick moment to let my eyes roam over the surrounding woodlands for any sign of movement, before quickly jogging around my Jeep and toward the compound's entrance. I passed through an open doorway, taking note of the heavy chain-link gate that was lying twisted 15 feet inside the fence. Another dozen paces, and I was at the base of the stairs, craning my neck to make sure nothing was awaiting me above. I kept the mic on my shoulder and said in a low voice, "Billy, I'm outside your tower right now, heading up. For Christ's sake, don't shoot me." I turned the volume on the speaker down just in time for his response. "Damn it, John. I told you to leave." Despite his words, the gratitude and relief were clear in his tone. I started up the stairs, revolver still held at the ready as my other hand ran lightly up the railing. My eyes were drawn to the red-black spots staining the gray paint of the steel steps. I found even more of the viscous liquid on the railing as I continued my ascent. Blood, but not Billy's. God, I hope that thing is lying in the woods, breathing its last breath. He definitely hit it, but I had no way of telling how seriously it was hurt. In a human, red blood indicated an arterial bleed, which was typically a fairly significant injury. With this thing, who knew what black-red meant? I climbed the rest of the stairs around the tower and stopped just below the open trapdoor. "Billy?" I called cautiously. A pause, then came his reply, shaky and with a wheezing sound I didn't like at all. "How do I know it's you? Say something I couldn't have heard you say before." "I have always admired and respected you," I answered without hesitation. He said under his breath, "Come on up." I took another couple of steps, cautiously poking my head through the trapdoor. Billy was sitting upright, more or less, resting his back against the doorframe of his shack and aiming his own handgun generally in my direction. As soon as he saw my face, he dropped his hand to the side, the stainless steel barrel clanging against the metal walkway. As I stepped fully through the trapdoor, I noticed two things immediately. Firstly, there was a significant amount of that black-red goo splattered around. Secondly, I realized how badly injured Billy was. His face had gone gray with a sickly paleness, and his breaths came in ragged hitches. Blood-soaked bandages wrapped both forearms, and his face was covered in a crimson rag taped haphazardly down. His entire khaki park shirt was painted in a hellish tie-dye of shades of red, but it was his leg that worried me the most. A tourniquet had been tied around his thigh, and he was groaning, but the pants leg was a cherry red below that, glistening in the late morning light. "Jesus, Billy," I exclaimed, holstering my gun and rushing to his side. He waved me off, saying, "All beside me. I know it looks bad. Save it for later. Let's get out of here before that thing decides to come back for another round." I nodded and stood again, taking a quick glance past him into his shack. A twin of my own tower, normally Billy's looked like a war zone now. His table and desk had both been overturned and smashed, along with his base-set radio on the floor. On the floor nearby was a satellite phone, its antenna and display obviously smashed during the attack. Lifting his arm over my head, I helped him to his feet. He grimaced in pain, but threw his remaining strength in with mine, and we began the precarious descent through the trapdoor. "Did you at least get to make your phone call?" I asked him as we took the steps carefully and agonizingly slow. He shook his head. Got here just as I was getting ready to. Excusing your voice, telling me that you were from the Park Service and you were here to help. He looked at me with a shaking astonishment. Sounded just like you, John. I looked over the catwalk, railing down at it. He winced again as we stumbled on a step. Almost there, John, he continued. Well, yeah, I've never seen anything like it. I shook my head as we reached the bottom step and moved onto the rain-soaked ground. I grunted with exertion. Save it, Billy. We've got a long ride ahead of us. Plenty of time for that later. He just nodded as I maneuvered him and ran to the passenger side of the Jeep and helped him climb in. Once he was in, I hurried back around to the driver's side door, got in, started the engine, and pulled the door closed behind me. Throwing it into reverse, I felt the wheels break loose as I stepped on the gas with a bit too much enthusiasm. I swung the 4x4 around and put it into drive, pointing it back toward my tower and beyond. Safety. I only had a heartbeat's warning from Billy before I saw it barreling from the underbrush at us. It threw itself, a great mass, crashing into the side of the Jeep, and Billy scrambled to get away from it, damn near climbing over the center console in the process and knocking my hands off the wheel. In a panic, the Jeep swung wildly left, and I stomped down on the brakes to avoid slamming into the trees. One of the front wheels dipped off the road, and the steel bumper crashed through a small cluster of oak saplings, halting us abruptly. The engine stalled, and everything went silent in that moment as we froze. My breath hitched in my lungs, and my eyes widened in shock as I laid eyes upon the abomination for the first time. My first impression was that it was much larger than I had thought, but the nightmare visage before me eclipsed such a pedestrian observation. The thing stood in the middle of the trail, still shaking its head as if trying to recover its senses after the collision with a 2-ton vehicle. It looked vaguely humanoid in a sense, but it walked on 4 limbs, clearly proportioned to such a task. It was hairless, and its mottled pink-gray skin stretched taut over muscles, bones, and odd unidentifiable bulges. The limbs seemed to have joints that bent in all the wrong directions and ended in what had been claws, but instead of the distinctive keratin-composed sharp nails that seemed so familiar in the natural world, these seemed to be extensions of the creature's skeletal structure, protruding painfully through its veiny, translucent hide. The worst of all was the bulbous and disproportionately large head, topped with an oddly gaunt-appearing neck. It was oblong and reminded me of the shape of a feline's skull. Its mouth seemed a jagged tear across its face, with ill-fitting and chaotically positioned teeth that didn't seem to allow the mouth to close properly. I couldn't see any eyes, but where they should have been, instead, there were 2 bulbous and cyst-like organs, seemingly bulging and flattening in a slow rhythm as if bladders were filling with air or liquid. I reeled back in revulsion as it turned its sightless head in our direction, searchingly. Flaps of skin on either side of its malformed snout opened slowly, like some obscene blossom composed of milky gray bat wings, and I had the sense that it was using them to try to somehow locate us. It was then I saw where Billy's shot had struck the creature in the face. One of the snout flaps was nearly completely severed, hanging limply in contrast to its sibling. A gouge furrowed by the bullet's travel creased along the right side of the thing's head, piercing and ravaging the bulbous organ on that side and leaving it a deflated sac. When it turned its head further in our direction, I could see clearly where it had bled significantly from the shot, but I was horrified to see that the wound had already sealed itself, leaving a shiny silver scar to mark the incident. "I knew I hit you, you bastard," Billy whispered, half to himself. The mimic stopped its motion, and we watched as the uninjured bladder on its head expanded like a half-filled party balloon. It dipped its head a bit, and we saw 2 membranous slits in the top of its skull dilate. A moment later, the twisted sound of a human voice assaulted our ears. "I know you're out there." The voice was unmistakably Billy's, but it was distorted and wrong. I thought that the wound from his gunshot probably had something to do with that. The thing raised its head again, turning a bit more in our direction. It took a few experimental steps forward, then paused and lowered its head. This time, we heard what sounded like the painful roar of a beast, almost perfectly replicated, except for that same distortion we had heard previously. Killed a bear. I held my breath as we watched it again raise its head and take a few more contemplative steps in our direction, slowly swinging its grotesque snout back and forth. I could see how the flaps of skin that were flared open, where its nose should have been twitched minutely back and forth, and I felt like it was using them to listen for us. "Knows we're here somewhere, but he can't see us," whispered Billy, leaning close. "But if it gets close enough, I'm thinking we're done for." I looked over at Billy and realized that there was no way he'd be able to make a run for it in his condition. From the look of the thing growing ever closer to where we cowered in our Jeep, I thought it was likely we didn't have much time before it got close enough to hear our breathing, our heartbeats, or whatever, even inside the 4x4. And when that happened, I knew what would come next. Billy closed his eyes for a moment and turned to me. There was something in his eyes then, sort of acceptance. So he didn't like it one bit. "Get ready with the cannon," he whispered. "Only gonna get one chance at this." "What are you talking about?" I asked. A moment later, I had my answer. Billy took a deep breath and mustered every bit of strength to fling the door open and stagger out of the Jeep. "I'm right here," he shouted, limping weakly across the road from the Jeep. The mimic whipped its head in his direction instantly, but tilted its head to the side, seemingly momentarily puzzled at this unexpected turn of events. Billy held his own magnum in his hand, but it was too weak to raise it towards the beast. Still, he pulled the trigger, and a resounding boom seemed to shake the air. The mimic flinched at the defining sound of the gunshot, the flap of membrane at its snout snapping shut protectively. But its stunned hesitation didn't last very long. In an instant, faster than I would have thought possible, it launched itself on powerful limbs at Billy, knocking him to the ground and tearing at him with teeth and claws. I heard my friend screaming, then a horrible soul-rending sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. But now was my chance, and I took it. I swung the door open and stepped out of the Jeep, my gun coming free of its holster in the same moment. The creature was preoccupied with what was left of Billy, but as soon as I brought the gun up and thumbed back the hammer, its head swung around at me. It crouched like a compressed spring, preparing to launch, but I was quicker. The report of the gunshot was incredible, and the recoil from the powerful round rocked my wrist back painfully. The beast staggered, and I saw a burst of blood and tissue explode from a wound where its shoulder met its neck. It howled an otherworldly cry, sounding like a bedlam mixture of man and beast. But though the wound seemed terrible, it tried once again to throw itself at me. I was set on my course, though, and took step after step toward the creature, pulling the trigger again and again until the gun ran dry. All I was left with was the clicking of the hammer and a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The acrid smell of gunpowder stung my nose, and by the time I finally stopped, I found myself within only a few feet of the horrific thing. 6 blackened holes stippled the neck and torso of the creature where the bullets had entered, and I knew that the destruction of their exits on the opposite side would be far worse. The mimic lay sprawled across the ruined body of Billy Johnson, its weight crushing whatever had been left of my friend. Black-red blood spread out from beneath the thing's bulk like an oil spill across a smooth floor. I noted with some muted surprise that the creature still twitched and slowly flexed its powerful muscles, and a wheezing sound was quietly emanating from the slits on the top of its skull. I holstered my empty handgun and scanned around the ground for what I knew was there. A moment later, I spotted it. Billy's own magnum, lying half buried in the muck where it had been torn from its grip under the weight of the monster. I snatched it up and shook it clear of most of the mud and grass. Opening the cylinder, I saw that only one unfired round remained. That was enough, though. I approached the horror before me without apprehension or pause, my eyes focused on this thing that had caused so much pain and terror. I thumbed the hammer back and placed the muzzle against the mimic's head, which still convulsed with some small remaining life. I didn't know if it would be able to heal from the wounds I had already inflicted. Logic told me it was unlikely, but the silvery scar I'd seen from Billy's previous encounter caused me to question everything I thought was possible. I felt the tremors from the creature vibrate through the gun as the barrel rested against its skull, right between where its eyes should have been. I tensed my finger on the cold steel of the trigger, and the crack of the gunshot echoed throughout the forest. It was done. But even as I walked back numbly to the Jeep and restarted the engine, I wondered if that was true. I thought back to the journal I'd read, written more than 130 years before, and how it alluded to the tales of this creature going back long before then. As I drove the Jeep along the rough and winding service road, I wondered at the possibility that what we encountered was the only one of its kind. That the same beast had somehow terrorized cultures separated from each other by great time and distance, spawning the legends that the author of the journal and his companions pursued. It didn't seem likely. And now the door was open.